I was sipping a piña colada on a beach in the Maldives when my phone started exploding. 47 missed calls, 63 texts, all from the same people who told me I wasn't welcome at my own sister's wedding. You see, I'd just finished paying for that wedding. $100,000. My final transfer. The icing on a very expensive cake I'd been funding for 2 years. $250,000 total. And then came the text that changed everything. Family doesn't want you there, watch it online. Not an invitation withdrawal, not an apology, just watch it online. Like I was some distant acquaintance, some stranger who hadn't just bankrolled their entire fairy tale. I stared at that message for exactly 10 seconds. Then I typed back, "Sure, hope it's a memorable day." And I meant every word. Because what my family didn't know, what my crying, manipulative little sister and my guilt-tripping mother had no idea about, was that I'd read every single clause of that wedding contract. Every single word. So while they were panicking on what should have been the happiest day of Hazel's life, I was 2,300 miles away watching their perfect wedding implode in real time on a live stream I never planned to miss. My phone kept ringing. I kept ignoring it. Because this story. It's not about a wedding. It's about what happens when the family scapegoat finally stops playing the game. When the sister who always sacrifices everything decides to sacrifice nothing. And trust me, by the time this is over, you'll understand why revenge is a dish best served, with a cocktail umbrella and an ocean view. Let me take you back to where this really started. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 12 years, I've worked as a senior financial analyst at a consulting firm in Boston. I'm the person companies call when they need someone to find the numbers that don't add up, to spot the patterns everyone else missed. I've always been good with details, good at seeing what's really there beneath the surface. I just never thought I'd need to use those skills on my own family. The wire transfer confirmation appeared on my screen at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. $100,000. Sent. Irreversible. Final. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, then I closed my laptop and sat back in my office chair feeling something cold settle in my chest. That was it. The last payment. Over the past 2 years, I'd wired written checks and transferred a total of $250,000 for my sister Hazel's wedding. $250,000. Most of my savings gone. Poured into a day that was supposed to be perfect for her. I told myself it was worth it. Hazel was my baby sister. 28 years old, sweet, and always a little helpless when it came to practical matters. When she'd come to me 18 months ago, crying about how she and Jacob wanted a beautiful wedding but couldn't afford it, I'd felt that familiar pull. That big sister instinct that had been drilled into me since I was 6 years old, and Mom first placed infant Hazel in my arms and said, "You have to take care of her now." I remembered that conversation so clearly. Hazel had sat on my couch, mascara running down her cheeks, and explained how Jacob came from a wealthy family, but they were old-fashioned about money. They wouldn't help pay for the wedding until after it happened. Some kind of test to see if Hazel was marrying him for the right reasons. It sounded strange to me even then, but Hazel had been so desperate, so heartbroken at the thought of a courthouse wedding when she'd dreamed of something beautiful her whole life. "I'll pay you back," she'd promised, gripping my hands. "I swear, Nat, the minute Jacob's family writes that check after the wedding, every penny goes back to you. With interest, I promise." I'd believed her. Or maybe I just wanted to believe her badly enough that I ignored the small voice in my head asking why Jacob's supposedly wealthy family couldn't just pay up front. My phone buzzed on my desk. A text message. I picked it up, expecting maybe a thank you from Hazel, an acknowledgement that the final payment had gone through. Instead, I saw my mother's name. Linda Carter. The message was short, brutally short. "Family doesn't want you there. Watch it online." I read it 3 times before the words actually penetrated. Then I read it again, certain I must have misunderstood. But no. There it was. Black text on a white screen, clinical, cold, decisive. I wasn't invited to my sister's wedding, the wedding I'd just finished paying for. My hands started shaking, and I had to set the phone down on my desk before I dropped it. I stood up, walked to my office door, closed it, and locked it. Then I walked back to my desk and sat down very carefully, like I was made of something fragile that might shatter. I picked up my phone again and scrolled back through my message history with my mother. With Hazel. Looking for something I'd missed. Some argument, some offense I'd committed that would justify this. What I found instead was a pattern I'd been too close to see. 2 months ago, Hazel had stopped responding to my questions about the wedding timeline. I'd asked when the bridal shower was happening, and she'd said she'd let me know. She never did. I found out later from a cousin's Instagram post that it had happened the previous weekend. Hazel mom and 12 of Hazel's friends at some wine bar downtown. I hadn't been invited. I'd told myself it was an oversight. A miscommunication. 6 weeks ago, I'd asked about bridesmaid dress fittings. Mom had told me they were still figuring out the schedule and would update me soon. I'd checked Hazel's social media 2 weeks later and seen photos of her and 4 bridesmaids in matching lavender gowns, champagne glasses raised, caption reading, "My girl's dress fitting success." I wasn't in the photo. I'd told myself maybe I wasn't a bridesmaid. That was fine. Hazel had her own friends. I was just the sister. Just the bank, apparently. 4 weeks ago, I'd asked Mom for the final guest count so I could authorize the last venue payment. She'd been vague. "Still finalizing things, honey. You know how these things go." I'd signed off on the payment anyway because the venue needed confirmation. Now I understood. They'd been finalizing how to exclude me while still taking my money. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the wedding invitation that had arrived at my apartment 3 months ago. Ivory, cardstock, elegant script, Hazel and Jacob's names embossed in gold. I'd kept it on my desk as a reminder of what I was working toward, what I was sacrificing for. I picked up a pen and wrote across the bottom in firm, clear letters, "Paid in full by the one not invited." Then I sat there staring at those words, feeling something shift inside me. The hurt was there, yes, raw and burning. But underneath it, something else was rising, something cold and clear and precise. I'd spent my entire career finding the truth in numbers, spotting the discrepancies, seeing what didn't add up. I'd been trained to think 3 steps ahead, to plan for contingencies, to protect assets. And 6 months ago, when something about this whole arrangement started feeling wrong, when my instincts started whispering warnings I didn't want to hear, I'd done something I'd never told Hazel or my mother about. I'd protected myself. I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder I'd created back in March. The label read Plan B Contingency Protocol. Inside were contracts, correspondence, payment structures. Every receipt, every wire transfer confirmation, every email where Hazel promised repayment. And one document in particular that I'd had my attorney friend review and notarize. A wedding sponsorship contract with very specific clauses about payment conditions and guest list confirmations. Clauses that my mother had signed without reading 6 months ago, when I'd told her the venue required formal documentation for large payments. Clauses that included one very important provision about what happened if the primary financial sponsor was removed from the guest list. I clicked open the file and began to read, and for the first time since receiving that text message, I smiled. They wanted me to watch online. Oh, I'd be watching. From somewhere much more pleasant than Boston. And they were about to learn that the sister they'd always underestimated had been paying attention all along. I spent the next hour methodically going through that folder, reviewing every document with the same careful attention I'd give to a client audit. The wedding sponsorship contract sat at the top of the stack, and I read through it one more time, my highlighter marking the clauses that mattered most. Section 4.2, Payment Completion, conditional upon sponsor attendance. Confirmation. Section 7.1. Guest list. Verification required 48 hours prior to final payment release. My attorney friend Rachel had looked at me like I was paranoid when I'd asked her to draft this 6 months ago, but she'd done it anyway. Just protecting your investment, she'd said. I'd nodded, not wanting to admit even to myself that I was protecting against my own family. I pulled my suitcase from the closet and began packing. Not the frantic packing of someone running away, but the deliberate packing of someone who'd planned this possibility. Swimsuits, sundresses, the linen pants I'd bought last summer and never had occasion to wear, a wide-brimmed hat, my favorite sandals. I folded each item carefully, precisely the way I did everything. The notarized contract went into a waterproof document folder, which I tucked into the inner pocket of my carry-on bag. I wasn't sure I'd need the physical copy, but old habits died hard. Always have backup documentation. My phone rang while I was zipping up the suitcase. Mom. Of course. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Let her wait. Let her wonder. Natalie. Her voice had that particular tone she used when she was about to justify something awful. Gentle, reasonable, utterly condescending. I know you got my text. I did, I said, continuing to pack my toiletries bag with one hand. Toothbrush, sunscreen. The expensive face cream I never let myself use because I was always saving money for something. For someone else. I need you to understand this is better for everyone. It's Hazel's day, and you know how she gets when she feels overshadowed. You've always been so successful, so accomplished. It makes her feel inadequate. We thought it would be easier if you just watched from home. You can still be part of it. I stopped moving, stood very still in my bathroom phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother explain how my success, my hard work, my achievements were somehow a burden to my sister. The sister I'd just given $250,000 to. Mom, I said, my voice perfectly calm. I hope you kept all the receipts. You're going to need them. There was a pause. What receipts, Natalie? What are you talking about? All of them. Every vendor payment, every deposit, every contract. You're going to want to have those organized and accessible. I don't understand. Why would I need... You will, I said. Enjoy the wedding, Mom. I hung up before she could respond. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That was interesting. Something had shifted in the past hour, some fundamental recalibration of who I was willing to be. The dutiful daughter was done. The woman who remained was someone new. Someone who'd been waiting underneath all along. I opened my laptop and pulled up my email, navigating to the sent folder. 2 weeks ago, I'd written to the venue coordinator. A simple professional inquiry. Hi, Jennifer. Just confirming the final guest list for the Carter Morrison wedding on June 15th. As the primary financial sponsor, I wanted to verify all attendees before authorizing the completion payment of $170,000. Could you please send me the confirmed list at your earliest convenience? The contract specifies this verification should occur 48 hours before final payment release. Thank you, Natalie Carter. Jennifer had responded within hours with an attached spreadsheet. I'd opened it, scanned down the alphabetical list of names, and found exactly what I'd suspected I would find. My name wasn't there. It had never been there. I'd forwarded that email to Rachel immediately with a single line, Clause 4.2 has been triggered. Her response had been equally brief. Standing by. Let me know when you want to proceed. I looked at that email exchange now, and something that felt almost like satisfaction settled in my chest. I'd asked the right questions. I'd documented everything. I'd protected myself the only way I knew how, with paperwork and proof and ironclad legal language. I pulled out a notepad from my desk drawer and wrote in clear, measured handwriting, "Enjoy the wedding. I'm done fixing your mess." I left the note on my kitchen counter, propped against the coffee maker, where I knew my mother would see it when she came by to water my plants while I was gone. She had a key. She'd always had a key. Another thing I'd need to change when I got back. My flight to the Maldives left in 6 hours. I'd booked it 3 weeks ago, right after receiving Jennifer's email with the guest list, a backup plan, an escape route. The resort had cost more than I usually let myself spend, but I'd reasoned that if I was right about what was coming, I deserved something beautiful. And if I was wrong, if somehow this all turned out to be a misunderstanding, I'd still have a vacation I desperately needed. But I wasn't wrong. I knew my family too well. I'd spent 34 years learning their patterns, anticipating their needs, sacrificing my own comfort for theirs. I knew exactly how this would play out. I pulled up a new email window and typed in an address I'd created specifically for this situation, an encrypted email service that Rachel had recommended. The recipient was listed simply as Legal Team Carter Case. The subject line took me a moment to compose. It needed to be clear, professional, and final. Phase 1 complete, monitoring active. The body of the email was longer. I outlined the timeline, the exclusion from the guest list, the text message from my mother, the contract clauses that had been violated, and the payment structure that was about to become very relevant. I attached scanned copies of every document, every receipt, every piece of correspondence. Then I wrote the final paragraph. I will be out of the country for the next 10 days. I will not be answering calls from family members. The wedding is scheduled for June 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Per the contract, the venue will attempt to process the completion payment of $170,000 at 2 p.m. that day. The payment will be declined due to guest list verification failure as outlined in Section 4.2. I expect significant contact attempts. Please monitor and document all communications for the record. I will review upon my return. I read it through twice, then hit send. The email disappeared into the encrypted server and I closed my laptop with a soft click. My suitcase sat by the door. My passport was in my purse. My phone was fully charged. In 48 hours, my sister would be standing at the altar in a $15,000 dress I'd paid for, in a venue I'd secured surrounded by flowers I'd funded, about to discover that fairy tales have a cost. And I would be 2,300 miles away, finally learning what it felt like to choose myself first. The Maldives resort materialized out of turquoise water like something from a dream I didn't know I'd been having. 26 hours of travel. 2 flights and a seaplane ride later, I stepped onto white sand so perfect it looked artificial. The air smelled like salt and frangipani, and the heat wrapped around me like a blanket I'd been missing my entire life without knowing it. I'd paid for this trip with money from an investment account I'd liquidated 3 weeks ago. A tech stock I'd bought 5 years back that had quietly tripled in value while I wasn't paying attention. I'd cashed it out, paid the taxes, and used the remainder for this. Self-funded peace, I'd thought when I made the transaction. Not a gift from anyone. Not borrowed. Not owed. Mine. The resort staff greeted me with cool towels and fresh coconut water, and I felt something in my shoulders unlock for the first time in months, maybe years. By the time I reached my overwater bungalow with its glass floor panels revealing fish darting beneath and a private deck extending over impossible blue water, I almost couldn't remember why I'd come here. Almost. I spent the first day sleeping. 14 hours straight, my body apparently deciding it had permission now to release every bit of exhaustion I'd been carrying. When I woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors I didn't have names for. I showered, changed into a loose cotton dress, and made my way to the resort's infinity pool as the last of the daylight faded into stars. That's where I met Helen. She was sitting in one of the shallow loungers built into the pool, a book resting on the water's edge beside her, a glass of white wine in her hand. She had white hair cut short and elegant skin, tanned and lined in a way that spoke of a life spent outdoors, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything. She looked at me as I slipped into the water, and something in her expression told me she saw more than a tired tourist looking for relaxation. "First time in the Maldives?" she asked. Her voice was warm with an accent I couldn't quite place. Midwestern, maybe. Cultured. "First time anywhere like this," I admitted, settling into a lounger a respectful distance away. "I don't usually do things like this for myself." "Ah." She smiled, and it wasn't a pitying smile, just knowing. "Running away or running toward—" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected small talk about the weather, the resort, the standard tourist pleasantries. Instead, she'd gone directly to the heart of something I wasn't sure I wanted to examine. "I'm not sure there's a difference," I said carefully. "Oh, there's always a difference." She took a sip of her wine, her gaze drifting out to where the pool seemed to merge with the ocean. "I spent 40 years as a family law attorney, retired 5 years ago. I've seen every variation of running you can imagine." Something about her straightforward manner made me want to be honest. Both, then. Running away from something and running toward myself. If that makes sense. Perfect sense. She nodded as if I'd answered a test question correctly. The best journeys usually are. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the water warm around us, the sound of small waves lapping against the pool's edge. Then Helen spoke again, her tone shifting to something more serious. "I once represented a woman who sued her family for financial exploitation. Her parents, 2 siblings, and uncle. They'd been taking money from her for years, using her credit, forging her signature, the whole terrible catalog of family theft." Helen's fingers traced patterns on the surface of the water. "We won. $2 million in damages and restitution. She got every penny she was owed." I found myself leaning forward, slightly drawn into the story. "But," I asked, because I could hear the unspoken word hanging in the air. "But she lost everyone. Every single person in her family cut her off, told their friends she was vindictive and cruel. She was right, and she was legally entitled to that money, but the cost was complete isolation from everyone who'd known her since birth." Helen looked at me directly then. She told me years later that she'd do it again, that the freedom was worth the loneliness, but I've always wondered if that was true, or just what she needed to believe to live with her choice. My throat felt tight. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you have that look," Helen said gently. "The look of someone who's about to burn something down, and I wanted you to know what fire costs before you light the match." I thought about the contract sitting in my bungalow, the email I'd sent to Rachel, the payment that would fail in less than 48 hours, the sister who would stand at an altar in a dress I'd bought in front of guests I'd paid to feed and discover that I wasn't as powerless as she'd assumed. "What if they already burned it down?" I asked quietly. "What if I'm just walking away from the ashes?" Helen considered this, then nodded slowly. "Then you're not running away at all. You're just refusing to rebuild something that was never meant to stand." We talked for another hour as the stars came out in full force above us, more stars than I'd ever seen in Boston's light-polluted sky. Helen told me about her grandchildren, her late husband, the cases that had kept her up at night, and the ones that had restored her faith in people. I told her about my work, about the satisfaction of finding truth in numbers, about how I'd always been good at seeing patterns, except when it came to my own life. When we finally left the pool, Helen touched my arm briefly. "Whatever happens," she said, "make sure you're choosing it, not just reacting. There's power in choosing." I went back to my bungalow and sat on the deck, my feet dangling over the water. I pulled out my phone and looked at it for a long moment. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages. I didn't read any of them. Instead, I turned the phone to silent mode, the vibrations off, everything muted except for the one app I'd downloaded specifically for this trip, the live stream app that would broadcast Hazel's wedding to invited guests and family members who couldn't attend. Family members like me. I kept the app open ready, then set the phone face down on the deck beside me. Tomorrow was the wedding. Tomorrow, everything I'd carefully constructed would either prove me right or reveal me as paranoid and vindictive. Tomorrow, I'd find out if my family would finally see me as something more than their personal bank account. Tonight, I sat under stars. My sister would never see, listening to water lap against the supports of my bungalow, breathing air that tasted like freedom. My phone vibrated once against the wooden deck. I picked it up and saw the notification banner. "Wedding ceremony begins in 10 minutes." I stood up, walked inside to the small bar area, and made myself a drink. Something tropical and ridiculous with too much rum and a paper umbrella. Then I returned to the deck, settled into the cushioned lounge chair, and opened the live stream. The screen filled with an image of white chairs arranged in perfect rows, an arch covered in flowers I recognized because I'd approved the florist's invoice and guests in expensive clothes taking their seats. I took a long sip of my drink and waited for the show to begin. The live stream quality was surprisingly good. High-definition, multiple camera angles, professional setup. I suppose that made sense, given how much I'd paid for the videography package. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched guests filter into their seats. Women in pastel dresses and men in summer suits. Everyone smiling and chatting like this was just another beautiful wedding on a perfect June afternoon. The string quartet started playing something classical and romantic. I recognized it from the music selection list Hazel had sent me 8 months ago, back when I was still included in planning discussions. Back when my opinion mattered because my money mattered. The camera panned across the flower arrangements, acres of white roses and peonies, each one costing more than most people spent on groceries in a month. I'd approved those invoices too. The processional began. Bridesmaids in lavender walked down the aisle in pairs, faces I recognized from Hazel's Instagram, but had never met in person. Then the music shifted to something grander, and everyone stood. The camera focused on the entrance, and there was my sister. Hazel looked beautiful. I had to give her that. The dress was spectacular, all lace and silk and tiny crystals that caught the light. Her hair was swept up in some elaborate style that had probably taken hours, and she was crying already, those pretty, delicate tears that somehow didn't ruin her makeup. She looked like every bridal magazine cover come to life, walking toward Jacob, who stood at the altar in his tuxedo, looking appropriately awestruck. I took another sip of my drink and waited. The ceremony proceeded exactly as planned. The officiant welcomed everyone, made some remarks about love and commitment, the usual beautiful sentiments that felt hollow when I knew what I knew about how we'd gotten here. Jacob and Hazel faced each other, holding hands, gazing into each other's eyes with an intensity that might have moved me if I hadn't just paid $250,000 to be excluded from witnessing it in person. Then, just as the officiant opened his mouth to begin the vows, I saw movement at the edge of the frame. A woman in a black suit walking quickly up the side aisle. Jennifer, the venue coordinator. I recognized her from our email exchanges and the one video call we'd had 6 months ago. She walked straight to the altar, not hurrying exactly, but with clear purpose. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. The music faltered. Guests turned in their seats, confusion rippling through the crowd like wind across water. Jennifer leaned in and whispered something to the officiant, then to Jacob, then to Hazel. Even through the camera, I could see my sister's face change, the dreamy expression cracking into something like panic. Jennifer stepped back and faced the gathered crowd, and someone must have handed her a microphone, because suddenly her voice came through crystal clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption. I'm Jennifer Morrison, the venue coordinator, and we have a payment discrepancy that needs to be resolved before we can continue." The whispers from the guests grew louder. I could see my mother in the front row, her face already reddening, starting to rise from her seat. Jennifer continued, professional and calm, as if she announced financial crises at weddings every day. The contract for this event specified a payment structure of an $80,000 non-refundable deposit, which was received 6 months ago, and a $170,000 completion payment, which was to be processed upon confirmation of the final guest list. I watched Hazel's hand go to her throat. Watched Jacob turn to look at his bride with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The contract included a specific clause," Jennifer said, and I could hear paper rustling as she pulled out a document stating that the completion payment was conditional upon the primary financial sponsor's confirmed attendance as an invited guest. Per the signed agreement, the guest list was to be verified 48 hours before the event. My mother was fully standing now, and I could see her mouth moving, though the microphone didn't pick up her words. Jennifer's voice remained steady. "The primary sponsor, Ms. Natalie Carter, was removed from the guest list 2 days ago. Per Section 4.2 of the signed contract, this action voided the completion payment. The payment was declined this afternoon when we attempted to process it. The venue erupted. I could hear the chaos even through my phone's small speaker. Guests talking over each other, someone shouting the string quartet sitting frozen with their instruments. The camera swung wildly for a moment before stabilizing on Hazel's face, which had gone from bridal glow to ash pale in seconds. Jennifer raised her voice slightly. The family has two options. You can pay the remaining $170,000 immediately to continue with the full ceremony and reception as planned, or we can proceed with the basic ceremony package already covered by the deposit, which includes this venue space for 1 hour and the officiant's services. No reception, no catering, no music beyond this point. My mother pushed her way to the front, and now the camera caught her clearly. Linda Carter, in her mother-of-the-bride dress face, twisted in fury, pointing at Jennifer like she could make this go away through sheer force of will. "This is extortion!" My mother's voice came through now, shrill and sharp. "My daughter already paid for this wedding. All of it. This is illegal." Jennifer held up the contract. "Mrs. Carter, this is your signature on page 4, acknowledging all terms and conditions, including the attendance clause. Ms. Natalie Carter structured the payment specifically to protect her investment, and you signed agreeing to those terms." I watched my mother snatch the contract from Jennifer's hands, watched her stare at the signature that was undeniably hers, watched the realization cross her face that she'd signed something without reading it, because she'd never imagined I would protect myself from my own family. Hazel was sobbing now, not pretty tears, but ugly, gasping sobs. Jacob had his arm around her, but he was looking at my mother with an expression that was rapidly shifting from confusion to anger. The guests had their phones out, dozens of them, recording everything. The camera angle switched again, catching the full scope of the disaster. The beautiful altar, the expensive flowers, the elegantly dressed crowd, and in the center of it all, my sister in her $15,000 dress, my mother clutching a contract she'd never bothered to read, and a venue coordinator calmly waiting for someone to produce $170,000 that nobody there had. I set down my drink and checked the live stream view count. Already climbing past 50,000, then 100,000. The comments section was scrolling so fast I couldn't read individual messages, just a blur of reaction and judgment and fascination. I closed the app and looked out at the ocean where the sun was starting to set in shades of orange and pink that Hazel would never see, because she was too busy watching her perfect day implode on camera. My phone started buzzing with notifications. I picked it up and saw the video had been clipped and shared across social media. 5 million views in 6 hours. The top comment with 200,000 likes read simply, "The excluded sister is a savage queen." I turned my phone face down and went to order another drink. By the time I woke up the next morning, the story had escaped the boundaries of wedding drama and become something else entirely. I made coffee in my bungalow's small kitchenette and opened my laptop to find my sister's collapsed wedding plastered across every major news outlet I could think of. Not just tabloids or gossip sites, but actual news organizations with editorial standards and fact-checkers. "Sister destroys wedding after being banned, genius or cruel," read the headline on a major women's lifestyle site. The article included screenshots from the live stream, quotes from supposed etiquette experts debating the morality of my actions, and a breakdown of contract law that was surprisingly accurate. They'd even found a legal analyst who explained that contingent payment clauses were perfectly valid and actually quite smart in situations involving large sums of money between family members. I scrolled through article after article, each one dissecting what had happened from a different angle. Financial experts praised the protective contract structure. Therapists weighed in on family dynamics and financial abuse. Wedding planners discussed whether venues should require such clauses more often. Someone had even created an infographic showing the payment timeline and contract terms, complete with highlighted sections and arrows pointing to the attendance clause my mother had signed. But it was the social media response that truly stunned me. I opened Reddit and found not one but 7 different threads about the wedding, the largest with over 40,000 comments. The post title read, AEITA Sister Edition Woman Pulls Wedding Funding After Being Uninvited, and the discussion had been going for 12 hours straight. I scrolled through the comments expecting condemnation, bracing myself for strangers telling me I was petty and vindictive and cruel. Instead, I found something I hadn't anticipated. Support. Overwhelming, passionate support. NTA, she paid for the wedding, they uninvited her. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Read one comment with 18,000 upvotes. This is what financial boundaries look like. Every eldest daughter who's been used as a family ATM is cheering right now, said another. The contract clause was genius. She knew her family would do this. She protected herself. That's not revenge, that's self-preservation, wrote someone else. The moderators had added a poll to the thread asking if my actions were justified. 80% voted yes. 80% of thousands of strangers looked at what I'd done and said I was right. I sat back from the laptop, something unfamiliar blooming in my chest. Validation, maybe. Or just the simple relief of being seen clearly by people who had no obligation to take my side. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, lit up with notifications. I picked it up and watched the screen fill with missed calls and text messages. 47 calls from Hazel's number, 32 from my mother, 15 from numbers I didn't recognize, probably relatives and family friends calling to tell me what a terrible person I was. I blocked them methodically, one after another. Hazel. Mom. The unknown numbers. I kept only one contact unblocked, Rachel's office line. If my attorney needed to reach me, I'd answer. Everyone else could wait until I decided I was ready to hear what they had to say. As I was blocking the last number, a new notification appeared. An email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line made me pause for the excluded sister. I opened it and found a link to a GoFundMe page that had been created sometime in the last 12 hours. The title read, Support Fund for Sisters Who Sacrifice Everything and Get Nothing. And the description told a version of my story that was surprisingly accurate given how quickly it must have been assembled. Someone had taken the time to compile screenshots, quotes from the news articles, and a passionate explanation of why what happened to me happened to countless women who were expected to bankroll their family's happiness while their own needs went ignored. The funding goal was set at $50,000, described as a symbolic gesture of solidarity. The current amount raised was just over $200,000. I read that number 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. But no, $200,000 in less than 24 hours donated by thousands of people I'd never met who'd seen what happened and decided they wanted to do something about it. The comments on the donations made my throat tight. For my sister who paid for everyone's college but her own. Because I was the family ATM for 20 years, and nobody ever thanked me. This is for every eldest daughter who learned to make herself small. I closed the laptop because I couldn't look at it anymore without crying, and I wasn't ready to cry yet. Instead, I walked out onto my deck and dove into the ocean, swimming hard and fast until my muscles burned and my mind finally went quiet. When I came back an hour later, dripping and exhausted, I found another email waiting. This one from an address I recognized. Jacob Morrison. My sister's groom. My sister's maybe not husband anymore, depending on how the rest of that disaster had played out. The subject line read, "You're right about everything, and I have proof you need to see." I hovered my cursor over the delete button. I didn't need proof. I already knew I was right. I'd lived it for 34 years. But something in the phrasing stopped me. Not "I'm sorry" or "please forgive Hazel" or any of the pleading I might have expected. Just a simple statement. "You're right." And an offer of evidence. I clicked open the email. The message itself was brief and businesslike, the kind of communication I'd expect from someone trained in professional correspondence. Ms. Carter, I apologize for contacting you directly, but I believe you deserve to know the full scope of what's been happening. I'm a forensic accountant and I ran background checks on your family before the wedding as part of standard financial due diligence. What I found concerns both you and Hazel. Your mother has been engaged in financial fraud that extends far beyond what happened with the wedding funds. I've compiled evidence that I think you need to see. The attached file contains records from 2018 through last month. I understand if you don't want to open it. But if you do, I think you'll understand why I can't proceed with this marriage until certain truths come to light. Respectfully, Jacob Morrison. I stared at the email for a long moment, then looked at the attachment. The file name was Clinical and Precise, Linda Carter Financial Records, 2018-2025 DOM, PDF. My hand shook slightly as I moved the cursor over the attachment. I'd thought I knew the worst of what my mother had done. I'd thought the wedding fund and the systematic exclusion were the full extent of the betrayal. But something in Jacob's careful wording suggested I'd only been seeing the surface of something much deeper. I thought about Helen's words from the night before, about the woman who'd won $2 million and lost everyone she loved, about the cost of truth and the price of freedom. Then I thought about those 200,000 strangers who donated money because my story resonated with something in their own lives. People who understood what it meant to be used and discarded by the people who were supposed to love you most. I clicked on the attachment and watched as the PDF began to download a progress bar filling slowly across my screen, carrying with it answers to questions I hadn't known to ask. The PDF took nearly a minute to download the progress bar creeping across my screen, while I sat frozen in my chair, half wanting it to finish and half hoping my internet would fail. While I waited, my mind did what it always did when faced with uncomfortable truths about my family. It went backwards, searching through memories for the moment when things had gone wrong, as if I could identify the exact point where love had curdled into exploitation. I was 10 years old when I baked my first birthday cake. I remember standing on a step stool in our kitchen reading the instructions on the back of a box mix because that was all we had in the pantry. My mother had promised me a party, had even let me invite 3 friends from school. But that morning, Hazel had woken up with a fever, nothing serious, but enough to send my mother into crisis mode. She'd called my friends' parents to cancel, then spent the entire day hovering over 6-year-old Hazel with cold compresses and children's Tylenol, murmuring reassurances. I'd waited until she was busy, then made the cake myself. Chocolate from a box with canned frosting I'd found in the back of a cupboard. I'd even found 10 candles in a drawer and arranged them carefully on top. When my mother finally came downstairs that evening and saw me sitting at the kitchen table with my homemade cake and no friends, she'd looked at me with such surprise as if she'd genuinely forgotten what day it was. "Oh, sweetie," she'd said, "you should have reminded me." But Hazel had needed her, and Hazel's needs always came first, and even at 10 I understood that my birthday wasn't an emergency worth remembering. 6 years later, when I was 16, I learned what it meant to make other people's dreams possible at the expense of your own. Hazel had been accepted to Westfield Academy, a private school with an arts program that my mother insisted would nurture her talents. The tuition was $18,000 a year, and we didn't have $18,000. We barely had $1,800. My mother sat me down at that same kitchen table and explained the situation with tears in her eyes. Hazel was special gifted, deserving of opportunities. Surely I understood. Surely I wanted what was best for my sister. I'd gone to school the next day and borrowed money from friends whose parents had savings accounts and disposable income. $200 here, $500 there, promises to pay it back from my part-time job at the grocery store. I'd cobbled together enough for the first semester, then worked 30 hours a week on top of school to cover the rest. My grades suffered. My college application suffered. But Hazel got her private school education, and when my mother thanked me, she'd said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. "It's your duty as the eldest. You're strong enough to handle it." The cake I'd baked myself. The education I'd funded with borrowed money and exhaustion. These were the small sacrifices, the ones I'd told myself didn't matter because family was supposed to take care of each other. But then came the $50,000. I was 24, 2 years into my first real job, finally earning enough to think about saving for my own future. My mother had called me at work, her voice tight with panic. Emergency medical bills, she'd said. A procedure not covered by insurance. She'd lose the house if she couldn't pay. I'd transferred the money that same day, didn't even hesitate, because when your mother says emergency, you don't ask questions. You just help. 2 years later, I'd been searching for my birth certificate in my mother's filing cabinet when I'd found the real estate documents. A house purchased 26 months earlier, down payment of $50,000, title in Linda Carter's name. The address was in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. I'd driven there on a Saturday morning and found a small bungalow with Hazel's car in the driveway. My $50,000 transformed into a house for my sister's future, a nest egg my mother was building for the golden child, while I lived in a rented apartment and tried to rebuild savings I'd never see again. When I'd confronted my mother, she hadn't even seemed to understand why I was upset. "I was going to tell you eventually," she'd said. "This is an investment in Hazel's stability. You're doing so well on your own. You don't need help the way she does." The progress bar on my screen reached 100%, jolting me back to the present. But before I opened the file, I pulled out my phone and navigated to the Notes app where I'd kept a journal for years. Most of it was mundane work thoughts and grocery lists, but there was one entry I'd written 3 years ago, shortly after discovering the house. I'd never shown it to anyone, never even read it again after writing it. But I needed to see it now, needed to remind myself why I'd been smart enough to protect myself this time. The entry was dated and brief. "They don't steal from you once. They steal your entire life, one sacrifice at a time, until you forget you were supposed to matter too. Until you can't remember what you wanted before you learned to want things for them instead." Mom took my birthday and called it love. She took my money and called it duty. She took my future and called it family. I don't know how to stop her. I don't know if I'm strong enough to try. But I know this can't be all I'm worth. It can't be. I read those words now, written by a version of myself who'd been drowning but hadn't yet admitted it, and felt something settle into place. That woman 3 years ago hadn't known how to protect herself, but she'd known something was deeply wrong. She'd planted a seed of resistance even if she couldn't yet act on it. The woman I was now sitting in a bungalow over crystalline water 2,300 miles from home had learned. I'd learned to read contracts and ask questions and trust my instincts when they whispered that love shouldn't cost everything. I closed the journal app and opened Jacob's PDF. The first page was a summary sheet, the kind of financial overview I created for clients when I needed to present complex information clearly. At the top, in bold letters, Linda Carter Financial Activity Analysis 2018-2025. Below that, a simple table. Money in, money out. Sources and destinations. The first line item made my breath catch. Wire transfer from Natalie Carter Wedding Fund, total received $250,000. The second line item, payments to wedding vendors verified $80,000. I stared at those two numbers, the mathematics of betrayal laid out in a spreadsheet. $250,000 given, $80,000 spent on the purpose claimed, $170,000 unaccounted for. My hands were shaking as I scrolled to the next page, knowing already that whatever Jacob had found, it was going to be worse than I'd imagined. Because it always was with my family. The truth was always deeper, darker, more calculated than I wanted to believe. I was halfway through page 2 when my laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Jacob Morrison's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether I wanted to have this conversation, then decided that if he'd gone to the trouble of compiling this documentation, I at least owed him the courtesy of hearing him out. His face appeared on screen, and he looked terrible. Exhausted, unshaven, still wearing what looked like the dress shirt from the wedding, though the tie was gone and the collar was unbuttoned. He was sitting in what appeared to be a hotel room, generic art on the walls behind him. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice formal despite the informal setting. "Thank you for answering. I wasn't sure you would." "I'm not sure I should have," I replied. But your email was intriguing. You said you're a forensic accountant. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. 15 years with Morrison and Associates. We specialize in fraud detection and asset verification. When my family learned I was getting married, they insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Standard practice for us given our portfolio. That meant running background checks and financial due diligence on Hazel's family. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You investigated us. I investigated your mother, he corrected. And what I found made me dig deeper. 3 prior bankruptcies under 2 different variations of her name. Outstanding liens on properties in 2 states. A pattern of opening credit accounts and defaulting that goes back 20 years. He leaned closer to the camera. Ms. Carter, your mother is what we call a sophisticated financial predator. She's been doing this for a very long time. I thought about the house with Hazel's car in the driveway, the birthday cakes I'd baked myself, the pattern I'd been too close to see clearly. The prenup, I said. You mentioned Linda avoided signing it. For 6 weeks. Jacob's jaw tightened. She kept finding excuses. The lawyer was too expensive. She needed time to understand the terms. She wanted to add clauses. Finally, 2 weeks before the wedding, she signed. But by then, I'd already found something that made me realize the prenup wasn't going to protect me from the real problem. What did you find? Credit accounts in your name. 4 of them opened over the past 3 years, total balance of $60,000. When I showed Hazel the evidence, she had no idea what I was talking about. She genuinely believed you were wealthy and successful and had paid for the wedding out of some unlimited reserve of money. He paused. That's when I realized Hazel wasn't complicit. She was another victim. The word victim applied to my sister felt strange. I'd spent so many years resenting her, envying the way my mother protected and prioritized her, that I'd never considered she might be trapped in a different kind of cage. The marriage certificate, I said, remembering what he'd mentioned in his email. You said it was never filed. Linda offered to handle all the paperwork, said she knew someone at the courthouse who could expedite processing. I thought it was generous, one less administrative task to worry about during the honeymoon. His expression darkened. 3 days ago, I called the county clerk's office to order a certified copy for some financial documentation I needed. They had no record of our marriage. I checked with the officiant. He'd given the signed certificate to Linda immediately after the ceremony. She was supposed to file it within 72 hours. She never intended to file it, I said, understanding clicking into place. If there's no legal marriage, she maintains more control over Hazel. No joint assets, no legal protections, easier to manipulate. Exactly. Jacob looked directly at the camera. Ms. Carter, I need you to understand something. I love Hazel, but I can't marry someone whose mother has been running financial schemes that could implicate my entire family. My parents trusted Linda when she told them Hazel needed emergency surgery last year. They wired $40,000 directly to what they thought was a hospital account. My hand went to my mouth. There was no surgery. Hazel had a routine dentist appointment that week. That's all. The money went into an account I've traced back to your mother through 3 shell companies. He pulled out a piece of paper and held it up to the camera. This is just one thread. I've found at least 7 other incidents where Linda borrowed money from people using fabricated emergencies. Your wedding contribution wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. I thought about all the times my mother had called with urgent needs, the medical bills, the car repairs, the property tax emergency. How many of those had been real? How many had I funded without question, because I'd been trained since childhood to believe that questioning meant I didn't love my family enough? Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why reach out to me specifically? Because you're the only one who saw through it enough to protect yourself. That contract clause was brilliant. It told me you already suspected something was wrong. He leaned back in his chair. And because I need your help. If I pursue this legally, if I go after Linda for the fraud against my family, Hazel could be implicated as an accessory. Her name is on some of the accounts. She signed documents Linda gave her without reading them. I've been trying to figure out how to protect Hazel while still holding Linda accountable. You want me to help prove Hazel was manipulated? I said slowly. That she didn't know what Linda was doing. I want to help both of you, Jacob said. I have 8 months of forensic documentation. Bank statements, forged signatures, the complete financial trail. But I'm an outsider. You're the one who's lived with this for 34 years. You're the one who can testify to the pattern of manipulation and control. I sat back processing what he was offering. An alliance with my sister's almost husband. A way to expose my mother that might actually protect Hazel instead of destroying her. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, my sister and I had both been victims of the same con, just in different ways. Send me everything you have, I said. Jacob nodded and started typing on his keyboard. A moment later, another notification appeared on my screen. An encrypted file transfer. Weddingfundtracker.xlsx, I read aloud. What am I looking at here? Every source of funding Linda collected for the wedding. Your $250,000 is the largest single contribution, but there were others. My parents, Hazel's godmother, 3 of Linda's friends. Even a small business loan Linda took out in Hazel's name. His face was grim. Total collected $427,000. Total actually spent on wedding expenses, I can verify $183,000. The remaining $244,000 went somewhere else entirely. I stared at the file name, my mind already calculating, analyzing, seeing the scope of what my mother had built. Not a wedding, a scheme, an elaborate con using her own daughter's marriage as cover. Where did it go? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be complicated and deliberately obscured. That, Jacob said quietly, is what I need your help figuring out. I knew exactly who to call. Michelle Chen had been my roommate junior and senior year of college back when we were both finance majors with different specializations. She'd gone into forensic accounting while I'd chosen corporate consulting, but we'd stayed close over the years, meeting for dinner every few months to complain about difficult clients and celebrate promotions. More importantly, I trusted her completely, and she had the technical expertise to untangle whatever web my mother had spun. I called her from my bungalow deck, watching the sun climb higher over the ocean, while her phone rang half a world away in Boston. Please tell me you're calling from somewhere fabulous, Michelle answered, skipping hello entirely. Because I've seen the videos and the news coverage, and you deserve to be on a beach somewhere while the internet loses its mind. Maldives, I said. And I need your professional help. I'm sending you encrypted files. I need to know where money went and what laws were broken getting it there. Her tone shifted immediately to business. Send everything. I'll clear my afternoon. I forwarded Jacob's files along with my own documentation, then waited. Michelle worked fast, but even she needed time to process years of financial records. I spent those hours swimming, reading on my deck, and pointedly not checking social media to see what new developments had emerged from the wedding disaster. When my laptop finally chimed with an incoming video call 6 hours later, I'd almost managed to convince myself that maybe the situation wasn't as bad as I feared. Michelle's face appeared on screen, and I knew immediately from her expression that it was worse. Nat, she said without preamble, how much do you know about identity theft? My stomach dropped. Theoretically or personally? Your mother opened 4 credit cards in your name starting 3 years ago. American Express Visa MasterCard and a Discover card. Current combined balance is just over $60,000. She pulled up a spreadsheet and shared her screen. The accounts were opened using your social security number, your date of birth, and addresses you haven't lived at in years. She's been making minimum payments to keep them from defaulting, but the interest has been compounding. This is why you couldn't get that bank loan last year for the condo you wanted to buy. I remembered that rejection letter, the confusion I'd felt when the loan officer mentioned my debt-to-income ratio was too high. I'd pulled my credit report and seen nothing unusual, or so I'd thought. How did I miss this on my credit check? She used old addresses and a P.O. box. The statements never came to you. She intercepted everything. Michelle's fingers flew across her keyboard. But that's just the beginning. The wedding fund money, the $170,000 that didn't go to vendors, I traced it through 3 accounts. First, it hit your mother's personal checking account, stayed there for 48 hours, then moved to a business account registered to something called Hazel's Future Enterprises. Hazel has a business. Hazel's name is on the registration, but she's not a signatory on the account. Only your mother has access. From there, the money was wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I can see the transfer out, but I can't see where it landed without a subpoena. I felt dizzy. The sophistication of it, the deliberate structure designed to hide and protect, was so far beyond what I'd imagined my mother capable of. What else? Michelle took a breath. Your identity was used to co-sign 3 loans over the past 4 years. A car loan for a Honda Accord registered to Hazel, $32,000. A personal loan described as apartment security deposit, $18,000. And a business investment loan to that same Hazel's Future Enterprises, $35,000. Total additional debt in your name, $85,000. The number was so large, it felt abstract. $85,000 of debt I'd never agreed to for things I'd never purchased attached to my credit history, like barnacles on a ship's hull. None of these loans are being serviced properly, Michelle continued. The car loan is 3 months behind. The personal loan is in default. The business loan has been restructured twice. Your credit score has dropped 140 points in the last 18 months, and you had no idea because all the collection notices were going to addresses and email accounts you don't monitor. I thought about all the opportunities I'd missed in the past year. The condo I couldn't buy, the lower interest rate I couldn't get on my car, the credit card application that had been rejected. All of it traceable back to damage I hadn't caused debt. I hadn't incurred a financial identity that had been stolen and destroyed by the woman who'd raised me. Michelle, I said carefully, in your professional opinion, what am I looking at here? She met my eyes through the screen, her expression grave. This isn't family drama, Nat. This is identity theft, wire fraud, and financial exploitation. These are federal crimes. The offshore transfer might add money laundering depending on what that Cayman account is being used for. If you wanted to press charges, the evidence is solid. Documentary trail pattern of behavior, clear intent to defraud. What kind of consequences are we talking about? Federal sentencing guidelines for this level of financial fraud, 10 to 15 years in prison. Restitution of all stolen funds plus penalties. Permanent criminal record. She paused. But you need to act relatively quickly. Some of these incidents are approaching statute of limitations windows. The older credit cards, for instance, might be harder to prosecute if you wait too long. I sat back in my chair, the ocean breeze suddenly feeling too cold against my skin. 10 to 15 years. My mother, who was 62 years old, could spend the rest of her functional life in federal prison. For stealing from her own daughters. For building a financial empire of fraud on the foundation of family trust. My phone rang before I could respond to Michelle. Rachel's office number. I held up a finger to Michelle and answered. Natalie. Rachel's voice was urgent. I've been reviewing the documentation you sent. We need to talk about next steps. If you want to press charges against your mother, Linda faces 10 to 15 years in federal prison for what she's done. But the statute of limitations is ticking on some of these offenses. We need to move fast if you're going to pursue this. Hey. I looked out at the ocean, at the paradise I'd bought with my own money, the peace I'd claimed for myself. Then I thought about my sister, about Jacob trying to protect her, about all the other people my mother had stolen from with her fabricated emergencies and manufactured crises. How fast? I asked Rachel. We should file within the next 2 weeks to be safe. I can start drafting the complaint now, but I need your decision. Are you ready to do this? I thought about the birthday cake I'd baked alone at 10 years old, the money I'd borrowed at 16, the $50,000 that had become my sister's house, the credit cards and loans and debts that had destroyed my financial future while I worked and saved and tried to build something for myself. Yes, I said. I'm ready. File the complaint. I flew back to Boston 3 days later. The Maldives had served its purpose, giving me distance and clarity, and the space to make decisions that would have been impossible if I'd stayed close to the wreckage. Rachel had advised me to return for the initial legal proceedings, and besides, I had things at my apartment I needed. Documents to organize. A life to reclaim from the ashes of the one my family had burned down. I'd been home less than 2 hours when I heard the key turn in my lock. For a moment, I froze confused about who would have access before I remembered. My mother had a key. And if my mother had one, she'd probably given one to Hazel at some point, another small way of signaling who really belonged and who was just permitted to exist on the periphery. The door flew open and Hazel burst in, still wearing clothes that looked expensive and carefully chosen, though her hair was unwashed and her makeup was smeared like she'd been crying for days. She probably had been. "You destroyed my wedding!" she screamed before I could even open my mouth. "You destroyed my reputation, my relationship, my entire life. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I set down the folder I'd been organizing and looked at her with what I hoped was complete neutrality. "I saved $250,000. You destroyed your own lies, Hazel. I just stopped paying for them." She stared at me like I'd slapped her. "How can you be so cold? You're my sister. You're supposed to love me." "I did love you," I said quietly. "I loved you enough to give you everything I had. Apparently that still wasn't enough to earn me a seat at your wedding. Mom said it would be easier without you there. She said you'd understand." Hazel's voice cracked. "She promised you'd forgive me like you always do. You always forgive me, Natalie. That's what we do. We're family." Something about the way she said it, the absolute certainty that my forgiveness was guaranteed, made my jaw tighten. "Tell me something, Hazel. Did Jacob's family really cancel the engagement?" Her face crumpled. "They think I was part of it. They think I helped Mom scam you, scam them, scam everyone. Jacob won't even talk to me until his lawyers finish some investigation. I've lost everything and it's all your fault." "My fault," I repeated, tasting the words. "Not Mom's fault for stealing the money. Not your fault for never once asking where $250,000 came from or whether I could actually afford it. My fault for finally saying no." "You don't understand what it's like," Hazel said, and now the tears were flowing freely. "You've always been the successful one, the smart one, the one who has everything figured out. I needed that wedding. I needed something beautiful and perfect because my whole life I've been standing in your shadow." I walked to my desk and picked up the folder Michelle had prepared for me. Copies of every fraudulent document, every stolen identity record, every piece of evidence of what our mother had really been doing all these years. I held it out to Hazel. "Read every page," I said. "All of it. And then decide if I'm still the villain in this story." She took the folder hesitantly, like it might burn her. "What is this?" "The truth. Everything Mom's been doing. Everything she's done to both of us." I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands surprisingly steady. "You said I don't understand what it's like to stand in someone's shadow. You're right. I don't. Because I've been too busy being the foundation everyone else stood on to cast any shadows of my own." Hazel opened the folder with shaking hands. The first document was a credit card statement, one of the 4 cards opened in my name. I'd put it on top deliberately because of what it showed. I watched her eyes scan down the list of charges, seeing her process the dates, the amounts, the descriptions. Her finger stopped on one line item. A charge for $6,200 to a luxury travel agency dated 2 years ago. The description read, "Paris Vacation Package Premium Tier." "I never went to Paris," Hazel whispered, her face draining of all color. She looked up at me, confusion and dawning horror mixing in her expression. "Natalie, I've never been to Paris. I've never even left the country." "Keep reading," I said. Hazel didn't leave my apartment for 6 hours. She sat on my couch with that folder spread across my coffee table, reading every document with an intensity I'd never seen from her before. She'd always been the dreamy one, the artistic one who didn't like dealing with paperwork or numbers or anything that felt too concrete. But now she read like her life depended on understanding every word. And maybe it did. I made coffee, made sandwiches that neither of us ate. watched my sister's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, anger, and finally, something that looked like grief. Around hour 4, she found the loan applications. I saw the moment she recognized her own signature on documents dated from when she was 17 years old, saw her mouth form the word scholarship before understanding crashed over her like a wave. "I remember this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was 16. Mom said it was an application for scholarship money for Westfield Academy. She said I needed to sign it so they could process my financial aid package." She looked up at me with eyes that were red from crying. "It wasn't a scholarship application, was it?" "It was a personal loan for $18,000, I said. "Co-signed in my name without my knowledge with your signature as the primary borrower. You were a minor. The contract should have been void, but Mom knew most lenders don't check ages carefully if the paperwork looks legitimate." Hazel's hands started shaking. She set down the document and picked up another one, this one a printed email chain. I watched her read messages from debt collectors that had been sent to an email address I recognized as hers, but with one letter different. A tiny alteration that would redirect mail to an account she'd never see. There were dozens of them, collection notices and payment demands and threats of legal action, all intercepted by our mother before Hazel ever knew they existed. "She told me you were wealthy," Hazel said, suddenly looking up from the emails. "She said you made so much money at your job that you didn't even notice when you helped family. She made it sound like asking you for the wedding money was like asking someone to spare change from their pocket." Her voice broke. I believed her. I never even questioned where you'd get that kind of money because Mom made it sound like nothing to you. I thought about all the times I'd worked overtime, taken on extra projects, skipped vacations and new clothes, and anything that felt like spending on myself, all to build savings that my mother had characterized as effortless abundance. She's very good at making people believe what she needs them to believe. Hazel pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed. I heard it ring on speaker, heard my mother's voice answer with false brightness. "Hazel, sweetheart, are you okay? I've been so worried." "Did you steal from both of us?" Hazel asked, her voice stronger than I'd expected. "Did you forge my signatures? Did you open accounts in Natalie's name? Did you lie about everything?" There was a pause. Then Linda's voice shifted to something softer, more wounded. "Hazel, honey, you don't understand. I did what I had to do to give you opportunities I never had. Everything I did was for you and your sister, to give you better lives." "You stole Natalie's identity," Hazel said. And now she was crying again, but her voice didn't waver. "You destroyed her credit. You took $250,000 and only spent $80,000 on my wedding. Where did the rest go, Mom? Where did all that money go?" "I was protecting it, investing it for your future. You have to understand, I grew up with nothing. I watched my mother beg for food. I swore my daughters would never know that kind of poverty." Linda's voice took on a pleading quality. "Everything I did was out of love." "Love doesn't steal," Hazel whispered. "Love doesn't forge signatures and intercept collection notices and lie about who has money and who doesn't. Love doesn't destroy one daughter to prop up another." She hung up before our mother could respond and sat there staring at her phone like she didn't recognize it. When she finally looked at me, her face was ravaged with the kind of pain that comes from watching your entire understanding of reality collapse. "My car," she said. "My apartment, my wedding, everything I thought I'd earned or deserved or worked for. It was all built on money stolen from you, wasn't it?" "Most of it, yes. And I never knew. I never even asked the right questions." She pressed her hands to her face. "How can you even look at me? How can you stand to be in the same room with me after what she made me into?" I sat down beside her on the couch, keeping a careful distance. "Because you didn't know Hazel. She manipulated both of us, just in different ways. She made you think I had everything, so you wouldn't feel guilty asking. She made me think it was my duty to give, so I wouldn't question why I was the only one sacrificing." Hazel looked at me through tears that were flowing freely now, and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before, Not the entitled little sister who expected me to fix everything. Not the golden child who'd never had to question where good things came from. Just a 28-year-old woman realizing her entire life had been a construction built on someone else's suffering. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small and lost. "Can we still stop her?" I thought about Rachel's complaint about the federal charges waiting to be filed, about the choice I'd already made sitting in paradise while my sister's wedding collapsed. "We can stop her," I said, "but it's going to cost us both everything we thought we knew about our family. Are you ready for that?" Hazel wiped her eyes and looked at the documents spread across my coffee table, evidence of years of systematic fraud and manipulation. Then she looked back at me and nodded. "Tell me what to do." Rachel's office occupied the 14th floor of a building in the financial district, all glass and polished wood, and the kind of quiet efficiency that came with charging $400 an hour. I'd been here before for contract reviews and business consultations, but never for something like this. Never to discuss sending my own mother to federal prison. Rachel met me in the conference room, spreading documents across the table with the methodical precision I'd always admired in her work. She'd been reviewing Michelle's forensic analysis for 3 days, cross-referencing it with federal statutes and case precedents, building what she called an airtight case. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, pulling up a summary document on her laptop. "Identity theft under federal law, wire fraud crossing state lines, financial exploitation of a dependent relationship. Any one of these charges would be serious. Together, we're looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison, possibly more, depending on how aggressive the prosecutor wants to be." I sat down across from her, feeling the weight of what I was about to set in motion. "Walk me through the problems." "The main complication is Hazel." Rachel pulled out 3 loan documents, each one bearing my sister's signature. "Her name appears as primary borrower on these loans. Total value $85,000. A prosecutor could argue she was complicit, especially since she benefited directly from 2 of them. The car, the apartment deposit. If they want to make an example of the whole family, they could charge her as an accessory to fraud." My stomach tightened. But she was 17 when she signed 2 of those. She thought they were scholarship applications. "I know, and that's our strongest defense. Contracts signed by minors are voidable under Massachusetts law. We can argue she was too young to understand what she was signing, that your mother deliberately misrepresented the documents." Rachel tapped the 3rd document. "This one is trickier. She was 21 when she signed this loan for her college tuition. She'd be harder to protect if she can't prove she was fraudulently induced." I thought about Hazel sitting on my couch reading through 6 hours of evidence, the look on her face when she'd realized what our mother had done. She didn't know the terms. Mom told her it was financial aid, handled all the paperwork, intercepted all the statements. Hazel never saw a single piece of documentation after she signed. That could work as a fraud defense, but it's not guaranteed. Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "Natalie, I need to ask you something directly. What do you want out of this? Because there's a version where we go after Linda with everything we have, and Hazel gets caught in the crossfire. And there's a version where we try to protect your sister, but that might mean accepting a slightly lighter sentence for your mother." I looked out the window at the Boston skyline, the city where I'd worked so hard to build something for myself, the place I'd called home while my family slowly dismantled everything I'd created. What did I want? Justice, yes. Accountability, absolutely. But revenge. Destroying Hazel to punish my mother. "I want justice," I said carefully. "But I don't want to destroy my sister if she was manipulated too. She spent the last 2 days realizing her entire life was built on lies and stolen money. She's a victim here, just a different kind than me." Rachel nodded like she'd expected this answer. "Then here's what I propose. We approach the prosecutor with a cooperation agreement. Hazel testifies against Linda, provides detailed accounts of how your mother manipulated her, forged her signatures when she was a minor, deliberately concealed financial information. In exchange, she gets immunity from prosecution. The testimony from a co-victim makes our case stronger anyway, shows pattern and practice of manipulation." Would she have to testify in court? In front of Mom? Potentially, yes. if this goes to trial. Though there's a good chance Linda takes a plea deal once she sees the evidence and knows her own daughter is willing to testify against her. Rachel pulled up a draft cooperation agreement on her screen. The prosecutor would want detailed statements, documentation of every time Linda lied to her, every signature she forged, every piece of financial information she hid. It won't be easy for Hazel. I thought about my sister asking me what to do, the desperation in her voice when she'd asked if we could still stop our mother. She said she wanted to help, but I don't know if she understands what that means. Then we need to make sure she does before she agrees to anything. Rachel started typing notes. I can have her meet with the prosecutor's office, let them explain exactly what cooperation would entail. But Natalie, you need to understand something too. Once we start this process, once we involve federal prosecutors and immunity agreements, there's no going back. Your mother will know Hazel chose your side. That relationship, whatever's left of it, will be over. I knew Rachel was right. My mother wouldn't forgive betrayal, especially not from the daughter she'd spent 28 years positioning as her golden child, her success story, her justification for everything she'd done. But maybe that relationship needed to be over. Maybe Hazel needed to break free the same way I was trying to. Set up the meeting, I said. Let Hazel hear what it involves. Then she can make her own choice. Rachel nodded and reached for her phone to call the prosecutor's office. Before she could dial, there was a knock on the conference room door. Her assistant opened it looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a Hazel Carter here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent and she needs to speak with Ms. Morgan. Rachel and I exchanged glances. I hadn't told Hazel where I was going today, hadn't wanted to pressure her before she was ready. But somehow she'd figured it out, tracked me down, shown up ready to face whatever came next. Send her in, Rachel said. The door opened and Hazel walked in looking small and frightened but determined. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her shoulders were set with something that looked almost like resolve. She looked at me, then at Rachel, then back to me. I'll testify, she said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. I'll tell them everything Mom did, every lie, every signature she forged, every time she manipulated me into thinking you were the problem instead of her. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. The package from Massachusetts General Hospital arrived 2 days after Hazel agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. I'd been expecting legal documents, court filings, the machinery of justice grinding into motion. Instead, I got a cardboard box with my father's name on the return label and a note from a nurse named Patricia, explaining that Richard Carter had suffered a minor stroke and wanted his personal belongings sent to me while he recovered. I carried the box to my kitchen table and opened it slowly, half afraid of what I'd find. My father had always been the quiet one in our family, the man who worked his accounting job, and came home and disappeared into his study or the garage, avoiding conflict with the same dedication most people brought to pursuing it. I'd never blamed him for my mother's behavior because he'd seemed as much a victim of her manipulations as Hazel and I were just older and more resigned to it. Inside the box were the usual items you'd expect from a hospital stay. Reading glasses, a paperback mystery novel, his wedding ring, which surprised me because I'd assumed he still wore it. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been carried and handled for years. I pulled it out and opened to the first page. My father's handwriting, neat and precise as always, dated 23 years ago. The entry was short. Linda borrowed $3,000 from Natalie's college fund today. Told her it was for car repairs. The car is fine. I don't know where the money went. I should say something. I won't. My hands started shaking. I flipped forward, scanning entries that spanned 2 decades of my life. Each one documented something my mother had done, some theft or manipulation or lie, and each one ended the same way. I should say something. I won't. I'm a coward. I chose peace. There were entries about the $50,000 I'd loaned her, which my father had known immediately wasn't for medical bills. Entries about Hazel's signatures on loan documents when she was too young to understand. Entries about credit cards opened in my name, about intercepted mail, about elaborate stories my mother had spun to explain why she needed money from relatives and friends, and anyone who would give it to her. My father had documented everything. He'd seen it all, understood exactly what was happening, and done absolutely nothing to stop it. I found an entry from 6 years ago that made me close the journal and walk away for a moment, too angry to keep reading. Linda is destroying Natalie's credit. I can see the bills she hides, the collection notices she intercepts. My daughter is working herself to exhaustion to save money that Linda steals as fast as Natalie can earn it. I tell myself I stay quiet to keep the family together. The truth is, I'm just afraid. Afraid Linda will leave. Afraid the girls will blame me. Afraid of being alone. So I do nothing, and my silence makes me complicit in everything she does to them. I wanted to call the hospital and scream at him, demand to know how he could watch this happen for 20 years and never once warn me, never once stand between his wife and his daughters. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. Sadness, maybe. Recognition that my father had been trapped in his own kind of cage, one built from fear and conflict avoidance, and the terrible human capacity to rationalize inaction. I kept reading. The entries grew more detailed as the years progressed, as if my father had decided that if he couldn't act, he could at least bear witness. There were entries about every major theft, every manipulation, every time my mother had used one daughter to control the other. And then 5 years ago, the entries changed. I can't stop Linda. I've proven that to myself over and over. But I can try to repair some of the damage. I've opened a separate account, one she doesn't know about. Every bonus, every tax refund, every bit of money I can hide from her goes into this account. It's for Natalie, for when she finally understands what her mother has done to her, for when she's ready to break free. I flipped forward frantically looking for more details, and found them in an entry from 3 months ago. The account has $500,000 now, enough to replace what Linda has stolen, and then some. I keep meaning to tell Natalie about it, to give her the account information and let her access her own salvation. But if Linda finds out, she'll demand half in the divorce I know is coming. She'll claim it's marital property. She'll find a way to take it like she's taken everything else. So I stay silent again, waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never comes, because I'm too much of a coward to create it. There was a letter tucked into the back of the journal, sealed in an envelope with my name written across it in my father's careful script. I opened it with trembling fingers and read words that felt like they'd been written by a ghost. Natalie, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to give you what you're owed, or I died before I could be that brave. Either way, I need you to know that I saw everything. I documented everything. And I did nothing to stop it, because I was afraid of what standing up would cost me. I chose my own comfort over your protection, and that makes me as guilty as your mother in my own way. The account information is enclosed. The money is yours, earned through my silence and your suffering. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's all I have to give you now. Please forgive me for being the father who watched instead of the father who fought. I loved you. I was just too weak to show it when it mattered. The account information was paperclipped to the letter. A routing number, an account number, a balance that showed exactly what he'd promised. $500,000 hidden away while I'd struggled to rebuild credit. My mother destroyed while I'd worked overtime to save money she stole, while I'd sacrificed everything for a family that saw me as an inexhaustible resource rather than a person who needed protecting too. I was still sitting there holding my father's confession in my hands when my phone rang. Rachel's number. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Linda just hired a defense attorney, Marcus Chen, one of the best white-collar criminal defenders in the state. And he's already filed a motion claiming that you extorted the wedding money through the contract clause, that you fabricated evidence to frame your mother, and that this entire case is a vindictive daughter's revenge plot." I looked down at my father's journal at 20 years of documented proof that my mother's pattern of theft and manipulation went back further than any of us had realized. Evidence from a source Linda couldn't claim was biased or fabricated. Testimony from beyond the grave of silence. "Rachel," I said, "I think I just found our counter evidence." I should have anticipated that my mother wouldn't go down quietly. I'd spent 34 years watching her manipulate situations to her advantage, spin narratives that made her the victim and everyone else the villain. But somehow I'd convinced myself that faced with overwhelming evidence, documented fraud, and her own daughter's testimony, she'd have no choice but to accept accountability. I'd underestimated her one final time. The press conference happened 3 days after Rachel informed me about the defense attorney. I was at work trying to focus on a client presentation when my phone started buzzing with notifications. News alerts, text messages from friends, emails with links to a live video stream. I excused myself from the conference room and found an empty office, closing the door before I opened the first link. My mother sat at a table in what looked like a lawyer's office, flanked by Marcus Chen, and looking every inch the grieving, bewildered parent. She wore a simple navy dress, minimal makeup, her hair styled in a way that made her look older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. The performance had already begun before she even opened her mouth. "I want to start by saying I love both my daughters," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "What's happening right now is breaking my heart, but I need to speak the truth even if it's painful." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "My eldest daughter, Natalie, has struggled with mental health issues for many years. Depression, anger management problems, a pattern of jealousy toward her younger sister that I've tried desperately to help her overcome." I felt my breath catch watching her weaponize my lowest moments against me. Marcus Chen slid a folder across the table and my mother opened it with shaking hands. "These are emails Natalie sent when she was 19 during a very dark period in her life." She pulled out printed pages I recognized immediately. Messages I'd sent to a college friend when I was drowning in depression, working 3 jobs to pay for Hazel's private school while my own grades suffered. "I hate my life," she read aloud. "I hate who I've become. Sometimes I wish I could just disappear." The emails were real. The context was deliberately stripped away. "And these," Linda continued producing another document, "are therapy records from when Natalie was 22. She was receiving treatment for anger management issues for what her therapist described as unresolved resentment toward family members." She looked directly at the camera. "I thought she was getting better. I thought the treatment was helping. But now I realize the anger never went away. It just went underground, waiting for an opportunity to strike." Marcus Chen leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter believes her daughter engineered the wedding contract specifically to humiliate her sister. That she's been planning this public revenge for months, possibly years. The so-called evidence of financial fraud fabricated or misinterpreted to support a vendetta born from mental illness and sibling rivalry." I watched my mother nod along, adding, "The wedding contract had that clause because Natalie knew we'd eventually realize we couldn't have her there. She has a history of making scenes of turning attention to herself when it should be on Hazel. We were trying to protect Hazel's special day, and Natalie used that as an excuse to destroy it." The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, my mother painting a picture of a disturbed daughter with a persecution complex, a woman so consumed by jealousy that she'd fabricated an elaborate fraud scheme to punish her innocent family. She cried at appropriate moments. She expressed hope that I'd get the help I needed. She forgave me for everything I'd done because that's what loving mothers do. The comments section on the live stream was already turning. "If she has documented mental health issues, maybe we need to reconsider the narrative. Those therapy records are pretty damning. What if the sister really did fabricate this whole thing?" The support that had felt so solid just days ago was fracturing doubt, seeping in through carefully placed cracks. By the time I left work that evening, the media landscape had shifted. News outlets that had celebrated my protective contract were now running pieces with headlines like, "Mental Health and Family Conflict, When Illness Drives Revenge," and "Sister's Fraud Claims Under Scrutiny as Defense, Reveals Psychological History." Comment sections I'd avoided reading were now filled with people calling me psycho-unstable, a vindictive sister weaponizing mental illness accusations. My work email filled with messages from colleagues expressing concern, though I could read the subtext clearly enough. concern about being associated with me, concern about what my presence was doing to the firm's reputation. 2 clients requested different analysts for their accounts. My supervisor scheduled a meeting for first thing the next morning. I spent the night awake reading article after article, watching my credibility dissolve as strangers who'd never met me debated my mental stability based on emails I'd written 15 years ago and therapy I'd sought when I was barely an adult. The fact that I'd gotten help, that I'd worked through my problems and come out stronger was being used as evidence that I was fundamentally broken. Hazel called at midnight crying. She showed those emails on purpose. She knew exactly what she was doing. She's making people think you're crazy so they won't believe anything you say. I know. I said, too tired to feel anything but a dull ache where the anger should have been. What do we do? I thought about my father's journal, about 20 years of documentation that would prove my mother's pattern extended far beyond what I could have fabricated. I thought about Rachel's confidence that the evidence was solid, that truth would win. But I also thought about how easily truth could be buried under the right narrative, how my mother had spent decades perfecting the art of making people believe whatever version of reality served her best. We stick to the truth, I said, and we hope it's enough. The next morning, I walked into my supervisor's office, knowing what was coming before he said it. David had always been supportive, had promoted me twice in the 5 years I'd worked at the firm, but he also had a company to protect shareholders, to answer to a reputation that couldn't afford the taint of scandal. Natalie, he said, not quite meeting my eyes, we need you to take a leave of absence, paid of course, just until this media situation resolves itself. The attention is affecting our company reputation, and we've had some clients express concerns about the stability of their account management. How long? I asked, my voice flat. As long as it takes. A month, maybe 2. Once the legal proceedings are finished and things calm down. He shifted uncomfortably. This isn't a reflection on your work. You're one of our best analysts. But right now, with everything in the news, with your mother's lawyer claiming mental instability, I understand. I cut him off because I did understand. I understood that my mother had found the one weapon that could make people doubt everything else. Not evidence of her guilt, but questions about my sanity. Not proof of fraud, but suggestions that I was too damaged to see reality clearly. I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, carrying a box of personal items past colleagues who suddenly found reasons to be very busy with their computers. By the time I reached the elevator, I felt like a ghost in my own life, watching everything I'd built crumble because my mother knew exactly where to strike to make people question whether any of it had been real in the first place. The tide turned 48 hours later, and it turned fast. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by bankers' boxes of evidence, helping Rachel and Michelle organize my father's journal entries chronologically, when my phone lit up with a news alert. Jacob Morrison had called a press conference. I clicked on the live stream with my heart pounding, unsure whether this would help or make everything worse. Jacob sat at a table in what looked like a hotel conference room, wearing a suit and the kind of serious expression I recognized from our video calls. He had folders stacked in front of him, and unlike my mother's performance, there was nothing theatrical about his presentation. He looked like what he was, a forensic accountant about to present findings. "My name is Jacob Morrison." He began, his voice steady and professional. 3 weeks ago, I was supposed to marry Hazel Carter. That marriage is not happening. I'm formally annulling our relationship because I have evidence that Linda Carter, Hazel's mother, used fraud and deception to arrange the wedding as part of a larger pattern of financial crimes. He opened the first folder. I've spent 8 months conducting financial forensics on the Carter family finances. What I found was systematic theft, identity fraud, and financial exploitation targeting primarily Natalie Carter, but also other victims, including my own parents and multiple members of the community. He proceeded to lay out the evidence with devastating clarity. Bank statements showing the $250,000 I'd contributed and where it had actually gone. Credit card accounts opened in my name with charges I'd never made. Loan documents with forged signatures. The offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Every piece of information Michelle had compiled now being presented to the public by a third party with no apparent bias, someone who had everything to lose by telling the truth. Linda Carter's attorney has suggested that Natalie Carter fabricated this evidence due to mental health issues. Jacob continued, and I felt my stomach clench. I want to be clear, I am not related to Natalie Carter. I have no relationship with her beyond being her sister's former fiancé. The evidence I'm presenting was gathered independently through professional forensic analysis. This is not a family grudge. This is documented financial crime. While Jacob was speaking, Michelle had apparently been busy with her own strategy. My phone buzzed with another alert. An anonymous report had been leaked to major news outlets, a comprehensive financial analysis titled Pattern of Financial Exploitation, the Linda Carter Case Study. It was Michelle's work scrubbed of any identifying information about who'd compiled it, presented as if it had come from a whistleblower within the financial industry. The report detailed everything. $340,000 stolen from me over 7 years through various schemes. The identity theft, the credit fraud, the systematic interception of financial communications, charts and graphs showing the money flow, the pattern of behavior, the sophistication of the operation. It was the kind of document that couldn't be dismissed as emotional or fabricated because it was built entirely on verifiable financial records. The media response was immediate. News outlets that had run sympathetic pieces about my mother 48 hours ago were now scrambling to issue corrections. Breaking new evidence in wedding fraud case suggests extensive financial crimes, read one headline. Forensic analysis reveals systematic theft by mother, read another. But what truly shifted everything was the third victim who came forward that afternoon. Robert Patterson owned a small construction company in our neighborhood. I vaguely remembered my mother mentioning him years ago, something about charity work they'd done together. He held his own brief press conference standing in front of his business with a stack of receipts in his hands. Last year, Linda Carter approached me about a cancer charity fund she was running, he said, his voice shaking with anger. She said she was raising money for children's cancer research, showed me what looked like legitimate nonprofit paperwork, gave me tax deduction forms. I donated $80,000 over 6 months. He held up the receipts. There was no charity. The nonprofit registration was fake. The tax forms were fraudulent. Linda Carter stole $80,000 from me using a fake cancer charity, and when I discovered it and confronted her, she told me I must have misunderstood her intentions. Social media erupted. The hashtag that appeared wasn't the cruel ones from 2 days ago, but hashtag Justice for Natalie trending within hours with thousands of posts from people apologizing for doubting me, sharing their own stories of family financial abuse, condemning my mother's manipulation tactics. I watched people who'd called me psycho and unstable delete their posts and pivot to outrage at how my mother had weaponized mental health stigma. News outlets began running investigative pieces, finding other people my mother had borrowed money from over the years, tracking down the shell companies and false business registrations, building a picture of someone who'd been running financial scams for potentially decades. The narrative shifted from troubled daughter seeks revenge to sophisticated con artist exposed by brave victims. My supervisor called that evening. "Natalie, I want to apologize. We acted hastily. We'd like you to come back to work whenever you're ready. Take the time you need, but your position is secure." I thanked him and hung up feeling vindicated, but also exhausted. The truth had won, but only after I'd been publicly eviscerated, only after my mental health history had been broadcast to millions, only after I'd lost my job and my reputation had been shredded. The truth had won, but the cost had been devastating. Rachel called an hour later, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "The prosecutor's office just contacted me. They're moving forward with charges. Federal agents are executing an arrest warrant at your mother's house right now." I pulled up a local news live stream and found it almost immediately. Camera crews had gathered outside my mother's house, the same house I'd visited for holidays and birthdays, where I'd baked my own cake at 10 years old. Police cars filled the driveway, their lights cutting through the evening darkness. The front door opened and 2 federal agents emerged with my mother between them. She was still in the clothes she'd worn to her press conference, but her face had none of the composed grief she'd performed for the cameras. She looked smaller, somehow, older, stripped of the confidence that came from controlling the narrative. One of the agents spoke clearly for the cameras. "Linda Carter, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and financial exploitation. You have the right to remain silent." My mother's eyes found the cameras, and for just a moment, I saw her try to arrange her features into something sympathetic, something that would make people doubt what they were seeing. But there were too many cameras, too much evidence, too many victims who'd finally spoken up. The performance couldn't save her anymore. They led her to the police car, and I watched through my phone screen as the woman who'd spent my entire life stealing from me while calling it love was finally held accountable for what she'd done. The media footage of my mother's arrest played on loop for the next 24 hours. Every news station showed the same images: Linda Carter in handcuffs, federal agents on either side, neighbors watching from their porches as she was led to a police car in front of the house where she'd lived for 20 years. The spectacle was complete, a public humiliation that mirrored exactly what had happened to Hazel at the wedding. I should have felt satisfaction watching it. Instead, I felt something more complicated that I didn't want to examine too closely. Rachel called me the next morning to say the prosecutor wanted to meet. Linda had been arraigned, bail set at $200,000 that she couldn't post, and she was being held at the federal detention center pending trial. I drove to the prosecutor's office with Hazel, who'd insisted on coming despite my suggestion that she might want to sit this one out. Assistant District Attorney Karen Williams met us in a conference room with walls covered in legal certificates and commendations. She was in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had clearly seen every variation of human behavior criminal law had to offer. "Your mother gave a statement during booking," Karen said, sliding a transcript across the table. "Her attorney advised against it, but she insisted. I thought you should see what she said." I picked up the pages and started reading. The interrogation had started with basic questions about the charges, which Linda had answered with denials and deflections. But then something had shifted, and the transcript showed her breaking down the careful composure she'd maintained for decades, finally cracking under the weight of federal charges and inescapable evidence. "I did it for my daughters," she'd said, according to the transcript. "We were so poor after their father left, so desperately poor. Do you understand what that's like? Having 2 little girls and no money and no way to give them the life they deserved." I remembered that time, though. I'd been only 8 years old when my father left. I remembered government assistance and food banks and my mother crying in the bathroom when she thought Hazel and I were asleep. I remembered her working 2 jobs and still not being able to afford school supplies or birthday presents or anything beyond basic survival. The transcript continued with Linda describing those years, the fear that had consumed her, the desperation that had gradually transformed into something else. "I learned how to make money appear when there wasn't any, how to borrow and delay and redirect, how to make people want to help me, want to give me things. And it worked. My daughters had food and clothes and opportunities I never had growing up." Karen pointed to a section further down. "This is where it gets interesting from a psychological standpoint." I read Linda's explanation of her philosophy, the twisted logic she'd built to justify what she'd done. The eldest must sacrifice for the youngest. That's how families survive in poverty. My mother sacrificed for her younger siblings. I sacrificed for my family. So Natalie had to sacrifice for Hazel. It's just how it works. The strong carry the weak until the weak get strong enough to carry the next generation. "She genuinely believes this," I said quietly, looking up at Karen. "Many financial abusers do. They construct elaborate justifications that let them see themselves as protectors rather than predators." Karen pulled out another document. "But belief doesn't negate criminal behavior. The evidence against your mother is overwhelming. Identity theft, wire fraud, financial exploitation across state lines. We're looking at multiple federal charges, each carrying significant prison time." Hazel spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. "How long?" "If convicted on all counts at trial, 15 years, possibly more, depending on the judge's interpretation of the aggravating factors." She could be 77 years old before she's eligible for release. Karen's expression remained neutral professional. However, there's another consideration. Your mother is 62, has no prior criminal record, and could argue diminished capacity based on her own traumatic background. A good defense attorney, which she now has, might negotiate a plea deal for significantly less time. How much less? I asked. 2 to 5 years, depending on what we're willing to accept and what she's willing to admit to. Karen looked directly at me. But here's where you come in, Natalie. If you testify at trial, if you take the stand and detail everything she did to you over 34 years, the impact statement alone will push the judge toward the maximum sentence. Your testimony makes this personal, makes it impossible for anyone to see her as just a desperate mother who made mistakes. I felt Hazel's hand find mine under the table. If I don't testify, I asked, then we still have the documentary evidence, the forensic analysis, Jacob's testimony, the other victims. We can still convict her. But without the emotional weight of your personal testimony, without you standing in that courtroom and explaining what it felt like to discover your mother had been stealing your identity for years, the judge might be more lenient. She'd still go to prison, but maybe for 2 years instead of 15. Karen leaned back in her chair, studying my face. I need to be clear about something. This is not a legal question. We have enough evidence to proceed either way. This is a moral question. What do you want, Natalie? Do you want maximum punishment for what she did to you? Do you want her to spend the rest of her functional life in federal prison? Or do you want accountability with the possibility of eventual redemption? I thought about the transcript in front of me, my mother's breakdown during interrogation, her warped but genuine belief that stealing from me had been an act of love rather than betrayal. I thought about her childhood, which I knew had been marked by the same poverty and fear that had shaped her entire worldview. I thought about the birthday cake I'd baked myself at 10, the borrowed money at 16, the stolen identity at 30. I thought about all of it, the full weight of 3 decades of financial abuse dressed up as family obligation. And then I thought about who I wanted to be on the other side of this. Not who my mother had made me, not who the trauma had shaped, but who I chose to become when I finally had the power to decide. I need time, I said. I need to think about what justice actually means to me. Karen nodded as if she'd expected this answer. You have 2 weeks before we need to finalize our trial strategy. Take the time you need. But Natalie, understand this, whatever you decide, it will define the rest of your relationship with your mother and your understanding of yourself. Choose carefully. We left the prosecutor's office and stood in the parking lot, Hazel and I, both of us, holding the weight of a decision that would determine our mother's fate. What are you going to do? Hazel asked quietly. I looked up at the sky, at clouds moving across blue, and realized I didn't know yet. But I had 2 weeks to figure out whether I wanted revenge or something else entirely. I spent the first week of those 2 weeks doing nothing but thinking. I took long walks through Boston Commons, sat in coffee shops watching strangers live their uncomplicated lives, lay awake at night staring at my ceiling and trying to untangle what I actually wanted from what I thought I should want. Hazel called every day with the same message delivered in slightly different words. Our mother deserved the maximum sentence, deserved to lose everything. The way she'd tried to make us lose everything. Deserved 15 years in prison for 34 years of theft and manipulation. She destroyed you, Hazel said during one particularly intense conversation. She stole your money, your credit, your peace of mind. She made you work yourself to exhaustion while she took everything you earned. This isn't revenge, Natalie. This is justice. She deserves to face the full consequences of what she did. I knew Hazel was right about the facts. Our mother had done all of those things. She'd stolen systematically and deliberately, had built an entire architecture of fraud on the foundation of my trust. But every time I tried to imagine standing in a courtroom and advocating for her to spend the next 15 years in prison, something in me resisted. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because I couldn't figure out if pursuing maximum punishment would free me or just chain me to her in a different way. On day 8, My phone rang with an international number I recognized. Helen calling from the Maldives. "I saw the news," she said without preamble. "Your mother was arrested. I wanted to check on you." We talked for over an hour, and I found myself telling her everything. The evidence, the charges, the choice the prosecutor had given me, the weight of deciding another person's fate, even when that person had spent decades trying to destroy mine. "What do you think revenge actually accomplishes?" Helen asked, and I could picture her sitting by that infinity pool, the same place where she'd first warned me about the cost of burning things down. "It makes you feel powerful," I said, "like you're finally in control." "For how long? A day, a week?" "And then what? You've destroyed someone, even someone who deserved destroying, and you have to live with being a person who chose destruction." She paused, and I heard ice cubes clinking in a glass on her end. "Revenge is a meal that eats you alive, Natalie. It consumes you from the inside until you can't remember who you were before you started feeding it." "But she should face consequences. Real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist." "Absolutely. That's where justice comes in. Justice sets you free because it's not about your anger or your pain. It's about accountability, about the system recognizing that wrong was done and responding appropriately." Another pause. "But mercy is power, real power. The kind that comes from being strong enough to choose something other than maximum harm, even when maximum harm is justified." I thought about that conversation for the next 6 days. About the difference between revenge and justice and mercy, about what each one would cost me, and what each one would give me in return. I thought about my father's journal, his decades of documented cowardice, his choice of silence that had made him complicit in everything my mother did. I thought about becoming someone who chose differently, who found a way to hold people accountable, without becoming the kind of person who destroyed others, even when I had the power to do so. On day 14, I called Karen Williams and told her my decision. "I'll testify," I said. "I'll tell the truth about everything she did, every theft and manipulation and lie. But I want you to offer her a plea deal. 5 years in federal prison, full restitution of $340,000, and mandatory therapy for whatever trauma made her think stealing from her daughters was an acceptable way to survive." Karen was quiet for a moment. "That's significantly less than what we could get at trial. You understand that, right? With your testimony, we could push for 15 years, maybe more." "I understand. But I don't want to be the person who advocates for destroying my mother even if she deserves it. I want accountability. I want her to face what she did and hopefully understand why it was wrong. I want her to get help for whatever broke inside her that made this seem reasonable." I took a breath. "And I want to be able to look at myself in 10 years and know I chose justice over revenge, even when revenge would have felt really good." "Most victims don't think this way," Karen said, and I couldn't tell if she was impressed or disappointed. "Most victims probably weren't raised by someone who taught them that cruelty can look like love if you frame it right. I don't want to be cruel even to someone who was cruel to me. I just want this to be over." Karen accepted my terms and reached out to Linda's defense attorney. A week later, I found myself in a small conference room at the detention center, separated from my mother by reinforced glass and a telephone receiver that felt heavy in my hand. Linda looked different in the orange jumpsuit, her hair unwashed, and gray roots showing her face bare of the makeup she'd always used to present a carefully curated image. She picked up her phone and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "They told me you're testifying," she said. "They told me you're offering a plea deal, 5 years instead of 15. "Yes?" "Why?" The question was sharp, almost accusatory. "Why show me mercy I never showed you?" I thought about all the answers I could give. Because I'm better than you. Because I want to be able to sleep at night. Because destroying you won't fix what you broke. But what came out was simpler and more honest. Because I want this to end. I want you to face consequences and get help, and maybe eventually understand what you did to us. but I don't want to spend the rest of my life being the daughter who sent her mother to prison for 15 years. 5 years is enough for justice. Anything more is just revenge." Linda stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, something harder to define. "You'll regret showing mercy," she said finally, her voice cold. "I would never do this for you. I would fight with everything I had, and I would make sure you paid the maximum price for crossing me." "I know," I said quietly. "That's the difference between us." I hung up the phone and walked out of the detention center into afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. My mother would accept the plea deal, and I would give my victim impact statement, and then this chapter of my life would finally close. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate and less dramatic than what television had prepared me for. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, rows of benches where a handful of journalists and curious observers sat watching. My mother sat at the defense table in clothes her attorney had chosen to make her look respectable and harmless, her hands folded in her lap like she was at a church service rather than a federal plea hearing. I took the stand and placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then spent 90 minutes doing exactly that. I walked the court through the timeline with the same precision I'd bring to a client presentation. The birthday cake at 10, the borrowed money at 16, the $50,000 at 24 that had become Hazel's house, the credit cards opened in my name starting 3 years ago, the wedding fund that had disappeared into offshore accounts. Every theft, every manipulation, every lie documented and presented without emotion, because emotion would make it easier to dismiss. Karen Williams guided me through the testimony with questions designed to establish pattern and intent. How many times had my mother asked for money? How often had I discovered the money was used for purposes other than what she'd claimed? When had I first realized my credit had been destroyed? Then Marcus Chen stood up for cross-examination, and I watched him arrange his expression into something that looked almost sympathetic. "Ms. Carter," he began, "you've painted a very compelling picture of financial exploitation, but I'd like to talk about your mental health history." He produced a folder I recognized immediately. "These are therapy records from when you were 22 years old. Records showing you were diagnosed with major depressive disorder and were receiving treatment for what your therapist described as anger management issues, specifically anger directed toward family members." The courtroom murmured. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression neutral. "Your Honor," Karen objected, "the witness's mental health history from over a decade ago is not relevant to the documented financial crimes we're here to address." "It speaks to credibility and motive," Marcus countered. "If Ms. Carter has a documented history of anger toward her mother and mental health struggles, the jury deserves to know that context when evaluating her testimony." The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow it. The records can be admitted." Marcus turned back to me. "Ms. Carter, isn't it true that this entire case is just an elaborate form of revenge, that you've taken old resentments, legitimate or not, and constructed a narrative of victimhood to justify destroying your mother?" Before I could answer, I heard movement behind me. Hazel stood up from the gallery. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify." The judge looked surprised, but nodded for her to be sworn in. Hazel took the stand, and I saw my mother's face go pale. "Those therapy sessions Mr. Chen just referenced," Hazel said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "I drove Natalie to them. Every single appointment for 6 months. Do you know why she needed therapy at 22? She looked directly at Marcus Chen. Because our mother had just stolen her college fund, $50,000 Natalie had saved by working 3 jobs. Natalie had to drop out of university in her junior year. She was depressed because her mother had destroyed her future and called it love. She got help. She went to therapy and worked through her anger and came out stronger. Our mother's pattern of theft continued for 15 more years after that. Natalie healed. Mom never did." The courtroom went completely silent. Marcus Chen looked like he wanted to object but couldn't find the grounds. Then the back door of the courtroom opened, and a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes walked in. She approached the bench with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. "Your Honor, I'm Dr. Patricia Chen. I was Ms. Carter's therapist from 2013 to 2014. I'm here voluntarily as a character witness, and I have some clarifications about those records the defense just introduced." The judge looked at Karen, who nodded quickly, then gestured for Dr. Chen to take the stand. "Those anger issues Mr. Chen referenced were not pathological," Dr. Chen said once she'd been sworn in. "They were a completely healthy response to financial abuse. Natalie came to me after discovering her mother had stolen a substantial amount of money. She was angry, yes. Depressed, absolutely. But she sought treatment, did the work, and emerged from therapy with healthy boundaries and coping mechanisms. That's what recovery looks like." She turned to look at my mother. "I've read the case documents. Linda Carter's pattern of financial exploitation continued for 15 years after Natalie left my care. That's the difference between a victim who seeks help and a perpetrator who never stops. Natalie got better. Her mother got worse." Something in my mother broke then. I saw it happen, watched her careful composure shatter like glass. "I did it," she shouted, standing up despite her attorney's attempts to stop her. "I did all of it. Every loan, every credit card, every lie. I stole from both my daughters, and I stole from everyone who trusted me. I couldn't stop. I didn't know how else to survive." Marcus Chen grabbed her arm, trying to get her to sit down, but she pulled away. "I grew up so poor," Linda continued, tears streaming down her face now. "So desperately poor, and I swore my daughters would never know that fear. But the only way I knew how to keep that promise was to take and take and take until there was nothing left to take." The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Carter, please sit down. Mr. Chen, control your client." Linda finally sat, and Marcus leaned in to whisper urgently in her ear. After a moment, he stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, in light of my client's statement and the testimony we've heard today, I'd like to request a recess to discuss plea negotiations with the prosecution." The judge looked at Karen, who nodded slowly. "Court is in recess for 2 hours. Counsel will meet in my chambers." I stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs and found Hazel waiting for me. We didn't speak, just held on to each other while our mother was led out by her attorney, and Dr. Chen touched my shoulder gently on her way past. "You did well," she said quietly. "You told the truth. That's all you ever needed to do." The 2-hour recess stretched into 4. Hazel and I sat in a corridor outside the courtroom drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine and watching lawyers shuttle between the judge's chambers and conference rooms. Rachel came out once to update us, saying the negotiations were progressing, but complicated that my mother's emotional breakdown in court had shifted the dynamic in ways no one had fully anticipated. When we were finally called back into the courtroom, my mother looked diminished somehow, as if her confession had physically shrunk her. She stood beside Marcus Chen with her shoulders hunched, a different woman from the one who'd held that press conference accusing me of mental illness and fabrication. The judge entered and we all rose. He settled into his seat with the air of someone who'd presided over too many family tragedies to be surprised by another one. "We've reached a plea agreement," he announced. "Mrs. Carter, please stand." My mother stood Marcus Chen beside her, and I watched her face as the judge laid out the terms. "You will plead guilty to 1 count of identity theft, 1 count of wire fraud, and 1 count of financial exploitation. In exchange for your plea and cooperation, the prosecution has agreed to recommend a sentence of 5 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will be required to pay full restitution in the amount of $340,000, representing $250,000 in wedding funds, $60,000 in fraudulent credit card debt, and $30,000 in associated fees and damages. Additionally, you will complete a mandatory financial therapy program addressing the behavioral patterns that led to these crimes." Linda nodded, her voice barely audible when she said, "I understand, Your Honor." The judge looked at her for a long moment before continuing. "Mrs. Carter, this case represents one of the most profound betrayals of trust I've encountered in my years on the bench. You exploited your daughter's love for personal gain, systematically stealing from them while claiming every action was motivated by maternal devotion. While this court acknowledges that you experienced poverty and hardship in your own childhood, that history does not excuse the deliberate, sustained criminal behavior you engaged in for over a decade." He paused. "You stole not just money but trust. You stole not just opportunity but peace of mind. You stole your eldest daughter's financial security and then convinced your youngest that it was somehow an act of love. The damage you've caused will take years to repair if it can be repaired at all." My mother's shoulders shook with silent crying. "However," the judge continued, "I also note that your daughter, the primary victim, has chosen mercy over vengeance. She could have advocated for the maximum sentence. She did not. That speaks to her character, not yours, but this court will honor her wishes. The plea agreement is accepted. You will serve 5 years, and you will use that time to reflect on what you've done and hopefully emerge with some understanding of the difference between sacrifice and theft." The gavel came down, and it was over. The media was waiting outside the courthouse, cameras and microphones forming a wall between us and the parking lot. Rachel had advised me to say nothing, but I found myself stopping anyway. Hazel's hand in mine and facing the reporters who'd spent weeks debating my sanity and credibility. "I want to say something brief," I told them, and the questions stopped as microphones swung toward me. "I didn't want revenge. I wanted my life back. I wanted my mother to understand that love doesn't justify theft, that family doesn't mean unlimited access to someone else's financial security, that being the eldest daughter doesn't make you a perpetual ATM machine. I got justice today. Not perfect justice, but enough to let me move forward. And I hope other people who've experienced family financial abuse see this and understand that you can set boundaries, you can say no, and you can hold people accountable even when they're family." We pushed through the crowd after that, and by the time we reached Rachel's car, my phone was already buzzing with notifications. The GoFundMe that strangers had created had received another surge of donations, people moved by the verdict, and the statement by the story of an eldest daughter who'd finally stopped being everyone's safety net. By the time I checked that evening, $200,000 additional dollars had been donated, messages attached about healing and rebuilding and starting over. I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by silence, trying to process that it was actually over. My mother would spend 5 years in prison. I would eventually receive restitution, though I knew collecting $340,000 from someone with no assets would be its own lengthy battle. Hazel had moved in with a friend and was starting therapy to unpack 28 years of manipulation. My father was recovering from his stroke in a rehabilitation facility, the secret account with $500,000 finally transferred to my name. The numbers should have felt like victory. In some ways they did, but mostly I just felt tired and sad and ready to stop thinking about my family's dysfunction for a while. The letter arrived a week later, delivered to my apartment by regular mail. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, the careful script she'd always used for important correspondence. The return address was the Federal Detention Center. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it, wondering what she could possibly have to say now that the trial was over. The sentence delivered, the consequences finally inescapable. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread, to refuse her even this small avenue of communication. But another part of me, the part that had chosen 5 years instead of 15, needed to know what truth looked like from her perspective, now that all the lies had been stripped away. I opened the envelope carefully and pulled out 2 handwritten pages that would change everything I thought I understood about forgiveness. The letter began without preamble, my mother's handwriting smaller and less confident than I remembered, as if even her penmanship had been diminished by what she'd done. "Natalie, I don't ask for forgiveness. I know I have no right to that, and I'm not sure I'd believe it if you offered. But I'm asking you to understand something I've never been able to explain, maybe because I've never been able to face it myself until now, sitting in this cell with nothing but time to think about what I've become. I sat down at my kitchen table, the pages trembling slightly in my hands. I was 7 years old, the first time I watched my mother beg for food. Not ask politely, but beg. On her knees in front of a grocery store manager, crying and pleading for day-old bread they were going to throw away anyway. My father had drunk his paycheck again, and we had nothing. I remember the way people looked at her, the mixture of pity and disgust, and I remember thinking, I would rather die than ever be that powerless. The next paragraph detailed a childhood I'd only heard about in fragments. An alcoholic father who spent money on liquor instead of rent. Evictions every few months. Winters without heat. Her mother working 3 jobs and still unable to keep them fed consistently. The kind of poverty that wasn't just about lacking money, but about the constant grinding terror of not knowing if you'd have a place to sleep or food to eat from one day to the next. When I got pregnant with you at 23, your father and I were happy. Poor but happy. We had plans and dreams and each other. Then he left when you were 8, and suddenly I was my mother. Single, broke, terrified, with 2 little girls depending on me and no idea how to keep them safe. The fear was so enormous it felt like it would swallow me whole. I remembered those years differently than she described them. Yes, we'd been poor, but I'd thought we were managing. I'd thought my mother was coping. Reading her account now, I realized she'd hidden the depth of her panic from us performing competence while internally drowning. I learned how to manipulate people to get what we needed. How to tell stories that made them want to help. How to borrow and delay and redirect. And it worked, Natalie. It kept you and Hazel fed and housed and in school. It gave you opportunities I never had. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to tell the difference between what we needed and what I wanted. Between survival and greed. Between protecting my daughters and stealing from them. The honesty was startling. No deflection, no attempt to minimize what she'd done. Just a brutal accounting of how fear had transformed into something else. Something darker and more consuming. I was so afraid of poverty returning that I became the thief I'd feared as a child. I became the person who takes and takes. Because scarcity taught me that there will never be enough, that you have to grab what you can when you can, that other people's needs don't matter as much as your own survival. I broke the cycle wrong, Natalie. I should have broken it by loving you better, by teaching you resilience instead of making you a resource to be exploited. I should have given you the tools to build your own strength, instead of stealing your chance to discover it on your own terms. I had to stop reading for a moment, pressing my fingers against my eyes to keep the tears from falling. This was the mother I'd needed to hear from years ago, the one who could see clearly what she'd done and why it was wrong. But she'd only found this clarity now after everything had been destroyed, after all the damage was done and couldn't be undone. The final paragraph made my throat close with emotion I didn't know how to name. You became everything I couldn't be. Strong enough to set boundaries I could never set. Brave enough to face conflict I always ran from. Clear-sighted enough to see that love without respect is just another word for control. You stood up to me in that courtroom, told the truth. Even when it would have been easier to stay silent, and chose justice over revenge, even though revenge was what I deserved. I'm proud of who you are, Natalie. So desperately proud. Not because of anything I taught you, but despite everything I did to break you. You became whole anyway. You became yourself anyway. And that's entirely your doing, your strength, your choice. I can't take credit for that. I can only acknowledge it and hope that somehow, someday, you can look back at your childhood and see that even in all my terrible choices, I did love you. I just didn't know that love was supposed to set you free instead of chain you to my fears. The letter was signed simply, Mom, and beneath it she'd written one more line. You don't have to respond to this. You don't owe me anything. I just needed you to know the truth before I ran out of chances to tell it. I sat at my table for a long time, holding those pages and crying in a way I hadn't cried through any of this. Not angry tears or hurt tears or even relieved tears. Something else. Something that felt like grief for what could have been if she'd been able to see all this sooner, if she'd gotten help for her trauma instead of passing it down to her daughters like an inheritance. But underneath the grief was something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly. I wasn't ready for that. But understanding, maybe. Recognition that my mother was a broken person who'd broken me in turn, and that understanding the origins of her damage didn't excuse what she'd done, but did make it less personal somehow. She hadn't stolen from me because I didn't matter to her. She'd stolen because her own fear mattered more than everything else, and she'd never learned how to quiet it without taking from others. I pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, and I wrote a single sentence. Not a letter, not an explanation, just one statement that felt true enough to send. I'll visit you. Once. I addressed the envelope, sealed it, and walked to the mailbox on the corner before I could change my mind. The letter dropped through the slot with a soft thud, carrying with it a promise I wasn't sure I was ready to keep, but knew I needed to make anyway. When I got back to my apartment, Hazel was waiting on my doorstep. "She wrote to you too, didn't she?" my sister asked, and I saw she'd been crying. I nodded and led us both inside, and we sat together in my living room reading our mother's confessions and trying to figure out what came next. I waited 3 weeks before making the drive to the federal detention center. Hazel offered to come with me, but I told her this was something I needed to do alone. Some conversations required witnesses. This one required privacy. The facility was 2 hours outside Boston, a low concrete building surrounded by fences that looked exactly like what it was, a place designed to contain people who'd broken society's rules. I went through security, surrendered my phone and keys, and anything that could be considered contraband, and was led to a visiting room divided by reinforced glass partitions. My mother was already seated when I arrived. She looked older than the last time I'd seen her in court. Her hair completely gray now, without the dye she'd always used, her face bare and lined in the harsh fluorescent lighting. But her eyes were different somehow. Clearer, less calculating. She picked up the phone on her side of the glass, and I picked up mine. We sat in silence for 5 minutes. Just looking at each other, two women connected by blood and damage, trying to figure out what words could possibly bridge 34 years of dysfunction. Finally, she spoke. "You look different. Free somehow, like a weight lifted." "I am free," I said, and realized as I said it that it was true. "Not because you're here, though, that helps. But because I chose to let go of the anger that was poisoning me. I was carrying it everywhere, letting it color every decision, every relationship. I got tired of hauling it around." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I spent my whole life afraid of being poor again. And in the end, I lost everything anyway. My freedom, my daughters, any chance at redemption. The irony isn't lost on me." "You haven't lost Hazel," I said. "She's angry and she's hurt, but she still writes to you. She's working through it in therapy. Whether you two can rebuild anything depends on what you do with these 5 years." "And you?" she asked quietly. "Have I lost you?" I thought about that question, about all the ways she'd been losing me incrementally over the years without realizing it. Every time she'd stolen money and called it love. Every time she'd manipulated Hazel and called it protection. Every time she'd chosen her fear over her daughter's well-being. "You lost the version of me who would accept abuse and call it duty," I said. "But I'm here, aren't I? That has to count for something." My mother pressed her hand against the glass, and I noticed how thin she'd gotten, how the orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame. "Do you forgive me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to know if there's any possibility that someday I forgive you." I interrupted and watched shock register on her face. "Not for you, for me. So I can move forward without carrying you in my heart as a wound that never heals. So I can think about my childhood and feel sad instead of rage. So I can build a life that isn't defined by everything you took from me." She started crying, then tears running down her face unchecked. "Thank you. God, Natalie, thank you. I don't deserve it. I don't deserve any kindness from you after what I did. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, I said, my own eyes burning now. It's about deciding I deserve peace, and I can't have peace while I'm still feeding anger and resentment. So I'm letting it go. Not forgetting what you did. Not pretending it didn't damage me. Just releasing the part of it that's been eating me alive. Linda wiped her face with her sleeve, trying to compose herself. I'm in a program here. Financial therapy, addiction counseling, even though money isn't a substance. They're helping me understand the psychology of what I did, the trauma patterns I inherited and passed down. It doesn't excuse anything, but it helps me see how I got here. Good, I said. Keep doing that work. Figure out who you are when you're not running from poverty that isn't even chasing you anymore. Maybe when you get out, we can have a different kind of relationship. Not mother and daughter the way it was. Something else. Something built on honesty instead of manipulation. I'd like that, she whispered. Even if it takes years. Even if you can only stand to see me once a year. I'd take that over nothing. I looked at her through the glass, this woman who'd given me life, and then spent decades trying to steal it back in small increments, and felt something settle inside me. Not love exactly. Not the uncomplicated affection a daughter should feel for her mother. But something softer than hate. Something closer to compassion for a broken person who'd broken others in her brokenness. I should go, I said after another minute of silence. I have a long drive back. Will you visit again? I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe. When I'm ready. But don't wait for me, Mom. Do the work for yourself, not because you think it'll bring me back. I need you to understand that our relationship, whatever it becomes, can't be your motivation for healing. You have to want to be better for your own sake. She nodded, understanding, or at least accepting what I was saying. I love you, Natalie. I know I showed it terribly. I know love is supposed to look different than how I gave it, but I need you to know it was there underneath all the fear and theft. It was always there. I know, I said, and I did know. That was part of what made it so complicated, so hard to process. If she'd simply been evil, it would have been easier. But she'd been damaged and damaging, loving and destructive, capable of both maternal devotion and systematic theft. People were complicated. Families were complicated. Forgiveness was complicated. I stood up, and so did she. We looked at each other one more time through the glass, and then I hung up the phone and walked away. I didn't look back, didn't wave, just walked through the security checkpoints and out into the parking lot where spring sunshine felt impossibly bright after the institutional fluorescence inside. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, and let myself feel everything. Relief that it was over. Sadness for what had been lost. Hope for what might still be possible. And underneath it all, a deep, bone-level peace that came from knowing I'd chosen mercy without weakness, forgiveness without surrender. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my mother's contact information. Her number, her email, her address. All the ways she'd been able to reach me for 34 years. I stared at it for a long moment, then hit delete. The contact disappeared, and with it the last symbolic tie to the version of our relationship that had existed before everything fell apart. If she wanted to reach me now, she'd have to go through official channels, through the prison mailing system or supervised calls. No more direct access, no more ability to call at midnight with a crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. I started the car and drove away from the detention center, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was driving toward something, instead of running away from it. 6 months passed before Hazel showed up at my apartment with an envelope and a look on her face I'd never seen before. Not the entitled expectation I'd grown up with, not the desperate pleading from when the wedding had collapsed, but something quieter and more uncertain. Humility, maybe. Or just exhaustion from the weight of actually facing what she'd done. "I have something for you," she said when I opened the door. "Can I come in?" I let her in and made coffee while she settled nervously on my couch, the envelope clutched in both hands like it might escape if she loosened her grip. She looked different too, thinner. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, instead of the elaborate styles she'd always favored, wearing jeans and a plain sweater that looked like they'd come from a thrift store rather than the boutiques Mom had always insisted on. "I've been working," she said when I handed her a mug. 3 part-time jobs. Retail restaurant hostess and weekend shifts at a bookstore. It's not glamorous and the hours are terrible, but I've been saving everything I can. She opened the envelope and pulled out a check made out to me for $30,000. "This is what I've managed to save in 6 months. It's not enough. It's not even close to enough. But it's a start toward paying you back for everything Mom stole, using my name and my willful ignorance as cover." I took the check, staring at the amount and the signature that was shakier than I remembered Hazel's handwriting being. $30,000 in 6 months meant she'd been living on almost nothing, pouring every penny into this repayment that I'd never asked for. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "Yes, I did." She set down her coffee without drinking it. "I've been in therapy twice a week since the trial, working through everything, trying to understand how I let myself be so blind for so long. My therapist helped me see that I was the golden child, the one who got everything handed to her, while you worked yourself to exhaustion in the background. I knew it on some level. I just never let myself really know it, because that would have required changing, and changing was hard." She pulled out another envelope, this one thick with papers. "I wrote letters, 47 of them. To every person who was at that wedding, every friend who saw the live stream, every family member who watched me play victim when I was complicit. I told them the truth, that I didn't know the extent of what Mom was doing, but I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered where you got $250,000. I should have noticed you were struggling while I was thriving. I apologized for my part in it, even the unconscious parts." I opened the envelope and found copies of handwritten letters, each one several pages long, each one painfully honest about her role in the family dynamic that had allowed our mother's theft to continue for so long. "Some people wrote back," Hazel continued. "Most didn't. A few told me they never wanted to hear from me again. I don't blame them. I was so focused on being the princess in my own story that I never noticed I was standing on your back to reach the crown." We sat in silence for a moment, and I saw something in my sister's face that I'd been waiting to see for years. Not performance, not manipulation designed to get me to forgive her so things could go back to normal. Just genuine recognition of harm done, and the slow, unglamorous work of trying to become someone different. "The therapist helped me understand something else," Hazel said quietly. "Mom trained me to be helpless. Every time I had a problem, she solved it by taking money from you. Every time I wanted something, she made it appear without me having to work for it. She was building a version of me that would always need her, that would never be strong enough to leave or question or stand on my own. And I let her do it because it was easier than growing up." "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm 29 years old, working 3 minimum wage jobs, living with a roommate in an apartment that has mice, and learning how to budget for groceries. It's humbling. It's also the first time in my life I've actually earned what I have." She looked at me directly. "I can't undo what happened. I can't give you back the years you spent funding my life, but I can become someone you'd be proud to call sister instead of someone you have to rescue or resent." I set down the check and the letters, and really looked at my sister, at this woman who was finally doing the work of becoming herself, rather than performing the role our mother had written for her. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. That would take more time, more sustained change, more proof that this wasn't just another manipulation, but it was the beginning of something. "I'm starting something new," I said. "A foundation using the GoFundMe money and Dad's hidden account. Legal aid and support for people who've experienced family financial abuse. I've been working on it for 3 months and I'm almost ready to launch. It needs someone to run operations, handle day-to-day logistics, coordinate with lawyers and therapists and financial advisors." Hazel's eyes widened slightly. "You're offering me a job?" I'm offering you a chance to turn your experience into something that helps other people. It won't pay well at first. You'd basically be volunteering for the first year until we establish sustainable funding. But if you're serious about making amends, about becoming someone different, this is how you do it. Not with apologies and checks, but with sustained action that creates something good from all the damage. Hazel was quiet for a long moment, processing what I was offering. Not reconciliation, not absolution. Just the opportunity to prove through years of work that she'd actually changed. "What are we starting?" she asked finally. I smiled, feeling something like hope unfurl in my chest. Justice. For people like us. For eldest daughters and scapegoats and anyone who's been taught that family loyalty means accepting financial abuse. We're going to help them set boundaries, pursue legal action if they want it, and understand that saying no to family doesn't make you a bad person. Hazel stood up and extended her hand, formal and serious. "Then I'm in, for however long it takes. For whatever work you need done, I'm in." I took her hand and shook it, and we stood there in my apartment, sealing an agreement that had nothing to do with the sister relationship we'd been born into, and everything to do with the one we might be able to build from the ruins of what our mother had destroyed. I filed the paperwork to establish the Eldest Daughter Project on a Tuesday morning in October, 8 months after my mother's sentencing. The name had come to me during one of my walks through Boston Common, thinking about all the women who'd donated to that GoFundMe, who'd shared their stories of being the family bank, the eternal caretaker, the one who sacrificed while siblings thrived. We needed something that spoke directly to that experience, that made invisible labor visible. Rachel helped me navigate the nonprofit registration process, and Michelle volunteered to handle the financial oversight pro bono for the first year. With the GoFundMe donations and a significant portion of my father's hidden account, we started with just over $700,000 in funding. Enough to make a real difference if we used it carefully. Hazel worked 12-hour days getting our systems established. She found office space we could afford in a building that offered discounted rent to nonprofits. She built a database to track cases and connect victims with resources. She interviewed and hired our first staff attorney, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd left a corporate law firm specifically to do advocacy work. Watching my sister transform from entitled golden child to someone who showed up early and stayed late, who learned skills she'd never needed before, who approached every task with the kind of focus I'd only seen her apply to planning her doomed wedding, was its own kind of redemption. Our first case came through a referral from one of the therapists we'd partnered with. A 35-year-old woman named Jennifer, whose parents had spent her entire college fund, $150,000, her grandmother had left specifically for her education. They'd used it to fund her younger brother's medical school and her sister's wedding, telling Jennifer that family helped family, and she was selfish for wanting the money back when her siblings needed it more. Sarah took the case, and I watched her work with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd brought to my own situation. Documentation, timeline, proof of intent. 6 months later, we won, securing full restitution plus damages. Jennifer cried in our office when Sarah told her not just because she'd gotten her money back, but because someone had finally validated that what happened to her was wrong. The media attention from my own case had died down, but it flared back up when reporters discovered what I'd done with the aftermath. Articles started appearing with headlines like, "From Wedding Scandal to Advocacy Hero Natalie Carter's Second Act," and "Turning Trauma into Justice, How One Woman's Fight Against Family Fraud Became a Movement." I did a few interviews, always emphasizing that this wasn't about me anymore. It was about the thousands of people who'd experienced the same exploitation and had no idea they could fight back. The donations increased. The cases multiplied. Within 6 months, we had helped 23 families recover stolen funds, provided legal consultations to over 100 more, and established a network of attorneys across 5 states willing to take family financial abuse cases at reduced rates. We received $500,000 in donations from people who'd seen their own stories reflected in ours, who wanted to support work that finally acknowledged that family didn't excuse theft. Hazel proved herself over and over. She never missed a deadline, never dropped a ball, never fell back into the helpless golden child routine that had defined her for 28 years. After 12 months of volunteer work, I put her on salary as operations director. She cried when I told her not because of the money, which was modest, but because it meant I trusted her enough to make this official. We were working late one Friday evening reviewing applications for our expanding legal fund when the mail arrived with something that stood out from the usual envelopes. Heavy, cream-colored paper, expensive quality, addressed to me personally. I opened it and found an elegant card with embossed lettering. Complimentary stay for Ms. Natalie Carter and guest, 7 nights at Serenity Maldives Wellness Retreat. We remember where your journey toward justice began, and we'd be honored to host your return. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering the woman who'd flown to the Maldives a year ago, drowning in anger and betrayal, watching her sister's wedding collapse from a beach chair with a cocktail in her hand. That woman had been running from something. The woman I was now had something to run toward. Hazel looked over my shoulder and read the invitation. You should go. Take a real vacation. You've been working non-stop for months. We've been working non-stop, I corrected. And I'm not going alone. I handed her the card. Pack a bag. We're going to the Maldives. She looked at me with surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. Are you sure that place is where you went to escape from family drama? Taking me seems like it defeats the purpose. That place is where I went to figure out who I was outside of being everyone's solution to their problems, I said. And I think it's time we both learn what it means to be sisters by choice instead of obligation. Real sisters. The kind who can sit on a beach together and talk about something other than the damage Mom did to us. Hazel smiled, the first genuinely happy smile I'd seen from her in over a year. When do we leave? I looked at the invitation again at the dates, suggesting we could come any time in the next 6 months. Next month. We'll make sure Sarah can handle things here, and then we'll take a week to remember what peace feels like. I tucked the invitation into my desk drawer and went back to reviewing case files, but something had shifted. The work was still hard, the stories still heartbreaking, the victories still hard-won. But I wasn't doing it from a place of wound anymore. I was doing it from a place of purpose, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be here, building something that would outlast all of us. The seaplane touched down on turquoise water a year and 2 months after my first trip to the Maldives, and this time I wasn't running from anything. Hazel sat beside me, pressing her face to the window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time, which in some ways she was. Our mother had never taken us anywhere growing up, too busy managing the careful juggling act of debt and theft that had consumed her entire adult life. It's so blue, Hazel breathed. I didn't know water could actually be this color. We checked into the same resort, though I'd booked a 2-bedroom villa this time, instead of the solo bungalow. The staff recognized me, or at least pretended to greeting me like a returning friend. I wondered if they knew the whole story, if they'd followed the news coverage of the wedding disaster and the trial and everything that had come after. If they did, they were too professional to mention it. On our second day, I found Helen sitting in her usual spot by the infinity pool, a book open on her lap and a glass of white wine, sweating in the afternoon heat. She looked exactly the same, ageless in the way some people managed, and when she saw me approaching, she smiled with genuine warmth. "The warrior returns," she said, gesturing to the lounge chair beside her. "And not alone this time." I introduced Hazel, and Helen studied my sister with the same assessing gaze she'd once turned on me. "You have your mother's eyes," she said, and Hazel flinched slightly. "But you carry yourself differently now. Like you're learning to stand on your own foundation instead of someone else's." "I'm trying," Hazel said quietly. "It's harder than I thought it would be. The worthwhile things usually are." Helen turned back to me. "You look different, too. The weight in your eyes is gone. You look like someone who figured out what she was running toward." We talked for an hour, Helen asking about the foundation and nodding with satisfaction when I described the work we'd been doing. "Making meaning from suffering," she said. "That's the only way through it. You can't undo what was done to you, but you can make sure it wasn't done for nothing." That evening, Hazel and I walked to the end of the resort's longest pier, carrying a small wooden box that had traveled with us from Boston. Our father had died 3 months earlier, his heart giving out peacefully in his sleep at the rehabilitation facility. He'd lived long enough to see Hazel and me working together, to know that his hidden account had helped launch something good, to receive letters from both his daughters that didn't mention anger or blame. We opened the box and took turns scattering his ashes into water that was turning gold and pink with sunset. Hazel cried, and so did I, mourning the father he could have been, if he'd been braver, grateful for the father he'd tried to become at the end. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when it mattered," Hazel said, watching the ashes disperse into the ocean. "All those years when Mom was stealing from you, and I was just taking and taking without question. I should have seen it. I should have asked." "You were a kid then, a young adult who'd been deliberately kept ignorant," I said. "Mom was good at what she did. She built separate realities for both of us and kept us from comparing notes. You can't blame yourself for being manipulated by an expert. But you figured it out, Eventually, after losing hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of my life." I put my arm around her shoulders. "You're here now. That's what matters. You're doing the work, making amends, becoming someone different. That counts for more than you think." We spent the rest of the week doing nothing productive, swimming and reading and eating meals that someone else prepared, talking about things that had nothing to do with our mother or the foundation or the past. Hazel told me about a man she'd been seeing, someone she'd met at her bookstore job who didn't know anything about the scandal and liked her for who she was becoming rather than who she'd been. I told her about the therapy I'd started, working through my own patterns of overfunctioning and difficulty accepting help from others. One afternoon, lying on beach chairs while waves lapped at the shore, Hazel asked me if I regretted any of it. "I lost $250,000, I said, thinking about the question seriously. "I lost years of financial security. I lost the illusion that my family loved me the way I loved them. I lost a mother who I'll probably never have a normal relationship with." "That's a lot of loss." "It is." I turned to look at her. "But I gained my freedom. I gained the ability to set boundaries and say no without guilt. I gained a foundation that's helping people who thought they were trapped forever. And I gained a sister. Not the one I was assigned at birth, but the one you're choosing to become. The one who shows up and does the work and tries to be better. That sister, she's worth everything I lost." Hazel reached over and took my hand, and we sat there in silence, watching the sun move across the sky. Two sisters who'd survived the same storm and were learning how to build something new from the wreckage. On our last night sitting on the villa deck with the ocean dark and endless beneath us, I reflected out loud about the strange mathematics of the past year. I paid for a wedding I wasn't invited to. I got that money back through restitution I'll probably spend years actually collecting. But even if I never see a penny of it, even if Mom dies in prison unable to pay anything back, I still came out ahead. Because I got free. And freedom, it turns out, is worth more than any amount of money. My phone buzzed with an email notification, and I almost didn't check it, committed to staying present in this moment of peace. But something made me look, and I saw a subject line that made me sit up straighter. Book proposal inquiry, The Eldest Daughter Project. I opened it and found a message from a literary agent at a major publishing house. They'd been following the foundation's work, had seen the media coverage, and wanted to know if I'd be interested in writing a book about my experience. Not just the wedding scandal, but the deeper story of family financial abuse, the psychology of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic, the path from victimhood to advocacy. They were offering a substantial advance and promising that 50% of all proceeds would go directly to the foundation. I showed Hazel the email, and she read it with wide eyes. "Are you going to do it?" she asked. I looked out at the ocean, at the same view I'd had a year ago when I'd been a different person entirely, and felt something click into place. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." I signed the book contract 3 weeks after returning from the Maldives and spent the next 8 months living inside my own memories. The publisher had assigned me an editor named Margaret, who understood instinctively what I was trying to do. Not just tell the story of a wedding disaster, but excavate the decades of conditioning that had made that disaster possible. I titled it, Paid in Full: Breaking the Cycle of Family Theft. And writing it was harder than I'd anticipated. Not the facts which I had documented extensively, but the emotional archaeology of digging through childhood memories and reinterpreting them through the lens of what I now understood. The birthday cake I'd baked alone at 10 wasn't just a moment of maternal neglect. It was the first indication of a pattern that would define my entire relationship with my family. The money I'd borrowed at 16 wasn't generosity. It was the beginning of learning that my worth was measured in what I could provide rather than who I was. Hazel wrote the foreword, and when I read her draft, I had to set it down and walk away for a while because of how unflinchingly honest she'd been. I was the golden child, she'd written. I didn't know my sister was drowning under the weight of our mother's debts and my ignorance. I thought the gifts and opportunities appeared through some combination of Mom's resourcefulness and Natalie's natural abundance. I never asked where the money came from, because asking would have required acknowledging that something was wrong, and I didn't want anything to be wrong with a life that felt so comfortable. The writing process became its own form of therapy, distinct from the actual therapy I was still attending weekly. Putting words to experiences I'd minimized for years, seeing patterns emerge across decades, understanding how my mother's trauma had been passed down and transformed into a different kind of damage. I wrote about the psychology of financial abuse, the way families weaponized obligation and guilt, the particular burden placed on eldest daughters who were taught that sacrifice was love and boundaries were selfishness. The book published 14 months after I'd received that email in the Maldives, and I had no idea what to expect. Margaret had warned me that books about family dysfunction could be hit or miss, that the audience was unpredictable. But within 2 weeks of publication, Paid in Full hit the New York Times bestseller list. It stayed there for 6 months. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of emails from readers who saw their own families reflected in mine. Women who'd been the family bank, the eternal caretaker, the one who worked 3 jobs while siblings got college funds and weddings and down payments on houses. Men who'd been parentified as children, forced to raise younger siblings, while parents abused substances or pursued careers, or simply checked out. The invisible children who'd made everyone else's lives possible while their own dreams got deferred indefinitely. I kept my promise and directed 50% of all proceeds to the Eldest Daughter Project. The foundation's funding tripled, allowing us to expand to 15 states and hire a full staff of attorneys and therapists. We helped hundreds of families pursue legal action, recover stolen funds, and most importantly understand that what had happened to them was real abuse, rather than just unfortunate family dynamics. 3 months after publication, a letter arrived at the Foundation's office, forwarded from the publisher who'd received it at the prison's return address. My mother's handwriting, immediately recognizable despite being shakier than I remembered. I opened it alone in my office, unsure what I'd find. An attack on the book. A defense of her actions. A demand that I stop profiting from her mistakes. Instead, I found 3 pages of reflection that felt more genuine than anything she'd said in court. She'd read the book in the prison library, she wrote, and had spent weeks thinking about what I'd written, not defending herself, not making excuses, just sitting with the reality of what she'd done as seen through her daughter's eyes. "You broke the cycle the right way," she'd written near the end. "I broke it through theft and manipulation, trying to give my daughters opportunities by stealing them from others. You broke it through truth and boundaries and building something that helps people instead of using them. I'm proud of who you became despite me. I'm proud that you found a way to transform all that pain into purpose. And I'm sorry I couldn't be the mother who helped you do that instead of the mother you had to overcome." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer next to my father's journal and the original wedding contract that had started everything. Evidence of where I'd come from and how far I'd traveled. The email from my publicist arrived that afternoon, asking if I'd be willing to do a speaking engagement. A nonprofit organization working on family trauma issues wanted me to keynote their annual conference. 500 people expected, mostly women who'd experienced various forms of family financial abuse. They were offering a speaking fee that would fund the foundation's operations for 2 months. I looked at the email for a long time, thinking about standing in front of 500 people and telling the story I'd spent my whole life trying to hide. The shame and anger and confusion of being used by people who were supposed to love you. The long road from victimhood to agency. The choice between revenge and justice, between destruction and healing. Then I thought about all those emails from readers, all those people who'd written to say they'd felt less alone after reading my book, who'd finally understood that their family's treatment of them wasn't normal or acceptable, who'd started setting boundaries for the first time in their lives. I typed back a single word, yes, and the conference hall in Chicago held exactly 517 people when I walked onto the stage, and every seat was filled. Women of all ages, some in business suits and some in jeans, some who looked like they'd lived comfortable lives, and some whose faces bore the particular exhaustion that comes from decades of being used. They'd come to hear me speak about family financial abuse, about the invisible labor of being the designated caretaker, about the long road from victimhood to agency. I stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces. And for a moment, I was back in that courtroom, taking the stand to testify against my own mother. But this time was different. This time, I was choosing to tell the story, not being forced to defend it. I paid $250,000 for a wedding I wasn't invited to. I began, and the room went completely silent. My sister got married in a ceremony I funded but couldn't attend because my family decided I wasn't worthy of a seat. And when that wedding collapsed, because I'd protected myself with a contract clause, the world watched and debated whether I was a hero or a monster. I told them everything. Not the sanitized version from the book, but the raw, unpolished truth of what it felt like to discover your mother had been stealing your identity for years. What it felt like to choose between revenge and justice. What it felt like to forgive someone who'd never asked for forgiveness and might not deserve it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, I said, and I saw heads nodding throughout the audience. My mother is in federal prison. I remember every theft, every manipulation, every time she chose her fear over my well-being. But I forgave her anyway, not because she earned it, but because I deserved to stop carrying the weight of her crimes in my heart. I talked about justice, about the difference between punishment and accountability, about how I could have advocated for 15 years in prison, but chose 5 because I wanted my mother to face consequences and get help, not just suffer for my satisfaction. Justice isn't revenge, I told them. Revenge is about making someone hurt as much as they hurt you. Justice is about restoring balance and creating accountability. I got justice, and it was enough. And then I talked about peace, about the hardest lesson of all. Peace isn't silence. For years I stayed quiet, because I thought that's what family loyalty meant. I accepted abuse and called it duty. I sacrificed myself and called it love. But peace, real peace, only came when I learned that I owed no one my silence. Not my mother, not my sister, not anyone who tried to tell me that speaking truth was the same as being cruel. I spoke for 45 minutes, and when I finished, the entire room stood. The applause went on for so long I had to motion for them to stop, tears running down my face, as I looked at all these women who understood, who'd lived their own versions of this story, who'd come here looking for permission to set boundaries and claim their own lives. Afterward, dozens of them approached me. They shared stories of parents who'd stolen college funds, siblings who'd borrowed and never repaid, families who'd used guilt and obligation as weapons. Some had already taken legal action. Some were still trying to find the courage. All of them just needed to know they weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't bad people for wanting their families to stop treating them like ATM machines. I gave them what I wished someone had given me years ago: validation and permission, and the understanding that love should never cost everything. 6 months later, I returned to the Maldives alone. It had become my annual tradition, a week every year where I disconnected from the foundation and the book publicity and the constant stream of people needing help and just existed. Hazel understood. She ran the foundation beautifully in my absence, having fully grown into the role I'd offered her as a test of her commitment. I was lying on the beach on my last afternoon, eyes closed, listening to waves that never stopped coming and going when my phone rang. I'd kept it on this time just in case of emergencies. Hazel's name appeared on the screen. "We just helped our 100th case," she said, her voice breathless with excitement. "A woman in Oregon whose brother stole her inheritance. We got everything back plus damages. Case number 100 Nat. Can you believe it?" I smiled, feeling pride and satisfaction and the deep contentment that came from knowing we'd built something real and lasting. "I can believe it. You've done amazing work." "We've done amazing work," she corrected. "I'm going to take the team out to celebrate. Wish you were here." "I'll be back next week. Celebrate for both of us." We said goodbye, and I held the phone for a moment, looking at the screen at all the notifications and emails and requests that would be waiting when I turned it back on. Then I powered it off completely and set it aside. I lay back on the sand, warm beneath my shoulders, and closed my eyes. The sun painted patterns on my eyelids. The ocean whispered its eternal rhythm. Somewhere back in Boston, the foundation was helping people reclaim their lives. Somewhere in a federal prison, my mother was serving her sentence and hopefully learning what I'd had to learn the hard way, that stealing from people you love destroys both of you. And here, in this moment, I was finally completely free. Sometimes the loudest revenge is living well. Sometimes justice is moving forward instead of looking back. And sometimes peace is simply knowing you owe no one, not even family, not even people who share your blood and your history, your silence, your money, or yourself. I'd paid $250,000 for a wedding I wasn't invited to. But through that pain, through the collapse and the trial and the long work of healing, I'd gained something no amount of money could buy. I'd gained myself, and that was worth everything. The waves kept coming, and I kept breathing, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt like the person I was always meant to be. Finally, blessedly, irreversibly, free. And that's where Natalie's story ends. From a sister banned from the wedding she paid for to a woman who built an empire of justice from the ruins of betrayal. She lost $250,000, but gained something money could never buy herself. Now, I want to hear from you, because I know many of you watching this have your own stories. Maybe you're the eldest daughter who's been funding family emergencies for years. Maybe you're the one everyone calls when they need money, but never invites when they celebrate. Maybe you've been told that setting boundaries with family makes you selfish, that saying no means you don't love them enough. If any part of Natalie's journey resonated with you, drop a comment below and share your experience. You don't have to use real names. You don't have to tell the whole story. Just let us know you're out there, because the comment section of this video can become its own kind of support group. A place where invisible eldest daughters, forgotten caretakers, and family ATMs can finally be seen. And here's my question for you. Do you think Natalie made the right choice offering her mother a plea deal for 5 years instead of pushing for the maximum 15? Some of you might think she was too soft, that her mother deserved every year of that sentence. Others might see it as the ultimate power move, choosing mercy from a position of strength rather than grinding someone into dust just because you can. There's no right answer, but I'm genuinely curious what you think. Was it justice, or was it weakness? Tell me in the comments. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about family obligation and financial boundaries, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this every week. Real stories about real people who faced impossible choices and found their way through. Stories about revenge and forgiveness, justice and healing, breaking cycles and building new ones. This channel exists to shine a light on the experiences that don't get talked about enough, the painful family dynamics that happen behind closed doors, while everyone pretends everything is fine. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And remember, you don't owe anyone your silence, your money, or yourself. not even family. Especially not family. Thank you for listening to Natalie's story. I'll see you in the next one.